So did the Marxists actually win the Cold War? This was built off of a conversation that we were having a few nights ago. And we decided that we were going to do something of a deep dive on this because I'm old enough to remember the Berlin Wall falling. Right? Christian Hamilton, this is something they read about in history, but I remember watching it on TV. And I remember at that time just thinking like, well, this is it. I mean, there's just like the complete refutation of communism as Marxism as an ideology, the ascendancy of not only representative government, but also free market economics, like the general understanding that free market economics was superior to communist explanations of society and economics. It was just so abundantly clear that the fact that I'm sitting here in 2023 and we're hosting a podcast with this sort of title just seems absurd. But we came across a very, very interesting paper written by the Heritage Foundation, and we're going to go through point by point. A lot of things in there that we agree with, and there's some things we don't. But we do think they provided a lot of very good insight into what is happening and why, and will help us answer the question, did the Marxists really win? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument.
Today we are streaming on the Nick Freitas YouTube channel, Rumble, and the Making the Argument podcast channel on YouTube. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe to the Making the Argument podcast channel. If you want to search it, just make sure you search Making the Argument podcast, and it should pop right up right under Nick's channel. But we appreciate everyone here and everyone who has joined our circle community in the last couple of days. We've had a great time talking about our 90-day improvement project, and it's been a lot of fun. So let's get right to the show.
A lot of fun. I will say Hamilton was at the gym this morning.
I was.
Hamilton was at the gym.
I wasn't.
Yeah, Nick asked me to bring him some, muscle cream because I guess he put up 325 today.
What is muscle cream?
Muscle cream. It was an ointment for.
Actually, you guys, it's actually liniment ointment stuff for horses. Apparently, Nick's
It's
a horse.
ivermectin?
Anyways, I'm your host, Nick Freitas. Remember that was a delegates, but other than that, a relatively good guy. Everything she said was lies and propaganda. Don't believe it.
No. Everything she said is for sale now. Use promo code.
My beautiful bride, Tweena.
You guys, maybe we should.
We gotta keep rolling because it's live. Unfortunately,
I know, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone. It's okay. We will pull ourselves together.
Because last time Nick did the introductions, he called her Queen of the Beans.
That's
And there was a whole conversation in our circle group actually
it's
about that.
It's because she makes me nervous when she's here. Like I get nervous.
I'm Christian.
She's just so pretty. This is of course our resident historian and political prognosticator. Christian Hines.
Do you want Tina or me to do the rest of the introduction?
And then of course there's Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
I can attest that Nick did do 325 at the gym
Oh
this morning.
gosh, guys, this just sounds so punkish. Anyway,
Nick did nail the landing with that last
cool.
intro.
I like that you're strong, honey.
So today, the title for this episode is really esoteric, but the reason that that we're doing this is, as Nick hinted, we had a conversation on Thursday. It was one of these like late conversations where it was like Nick and myself and Hamilton. We were up here in the studio until like 2 a.m. or something like that. And we were going through just talking about, all sorts of different ideas for things about the show, but also politics as well. And I brought up that there was this report that I read from the Heritage Foundation. This was published in late November of last year. And when I read through this, and it's a long report, and I sent it over to Nick, and Nick read it as well, and he actually highlighted tons of segments in here that he thought was actually relevant to talk to a broader audience. And so eventually, things came together and we decided to make this as the episode. But the reason that we're doing it is because, unlike Nick, I'm not old enough to remember when the Berlin Wall fell down, but my mother is, and my mother remembers watching it on TV and thinking, man, this is really boring. What's on MTV? Because she was like, it was 89 and I was born in 94 and she was 20. She was the same age as Kurt Cobain. So, what would that make her? She was like in her early to mid 20s when the Berlin Wall fell down. She was having a time of her life, basically. Yeah. And I think that there was a lot of people that are in her age group because now she's in her 50s. And I think there's a lot of people that are in her age group that are like in Gen X, right? They kind of like grew up and they were like, just beginning their adulthood when this happened. They were in their early 20s or late teens or mid 20s. And this was just an event in history, many of which they didn't really pay a lot of attention to. But now, fast forward, 30 years later, And all those people that were having fun in their 20s are now living in their 40s and 50s and 60s in an environment that they feel like is completely different from the America that they knew growing up.
And it seems absurd. Like I can't emphasize this enough. If you were growing up like in the 80s and 90s, the idea that America was just on the ascendancy, not just militarily, not just economically, but culturally, was just a foregone conclusion. Like it was ridiculous to think it was any other way at that point. And so here's why this show I think is going to be useful is one for our audience members that didn't spend their formative years kind of seeing what was going on in the world at that particular time, has no recollection of the Soviet Union, and for some of our members that are more like my age, where they remember it and this just seems ridiculous. Like, how could this possibly be happening? That's what we're going to go through today. So step one is we're going to define our terms. And so I just pulled up some definitions here because I'm pretty comfortable with the definitions, but I always love to see how they change. So communism, this is from Merriam-Webster, a system in which goods are owned in common and are available to all as needed.
Wow, they really
That
changed
is their
it.
definition. Yeah. A theory advocating elimination of private property. That is a far
That's the
more
real
accurate.
definition.
If you really look at it, it was the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. So if we're being fair, it's not that communists didn't think you could own your toothbrush or your shoes, right? They didn't want you owning the means of production. Now, if you look at socialism, and this is again Merriam-Webster, and it's funny because they go with like guild socialism, utopian socialism, democratic socialism, a system of society or group living in which there is no private property, or any of various egalitarian economic and political theories or movements advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Here's what's so fascinating about this. How many times have you explained communism as what's the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production? And like, no, that's not socialism, that's communism. Okay. Any or various egalitarian economic and political theories or movements advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. A system or society or group in living in which there is no private property. And even then, I don't think that's totally accurate. Like I said, they usually believe that you can have private property in the form of like your toothbrush or shoes or shirt.
The way that I've heard it from other leftists is that they try to say, well, there's a difference between private property and personal property. And they would argue, I don't see the difference at all, but they would argue basically that your clothes are personal property, but private property, that's the evil thing where it's like you own the factory.
Yes. Yeah. And then Lenin said it was a stage of society in Marxist theory that is transitional between capitalism and communism and is distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. Right? So what's interesting is even when they talk about socialism as being somehow inherently distinct from communism, in which case I don't think it really is, but let's just, for argument's sake, say it is. It was still a transitional movement between capitalism to communism. So this idea that, no, this is all, communism and socialism are entirely different. No, they're not. They just aren't. Marx and Engels didn't think they were. Lenin didn't think they were, except that he thought it was maybe transformational or transitional. But this idea that we're just talking about two completely or entirely different theories, it's just not accurate. Just isn't accurate. Now, you could get into other things where you could potentially argue that communism and socialism might have emphasized different things at different points. And we're going to get into that today. We're going to get into some of the differences as we talk about this whole concept of cultural Marxism, which, oh, by the way, I love it now that cultural Marxism, which was not a phrase or a term that was coined by white supremacists or racists like that, it just wasn't, is now all of a sudden, if you bring it up, then you're associated with because bad people use the phrase cultural Marxism. If you use the phrase cultural Marxism, you're now a bad person. That's intellectually very, very poor reasoning. And we're gonna also explain why it's also completely and entirely incorrect. So communism and socialism, what's the generalized theme here? It's the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, right? So the means of production in general are generally owned what they would call in common, the way that's always been executed, at any scale has been the government owns the factories, the government owns the means of production. Now, communists will argue that, well, if you really understood Marx, that at the end there would be no government whatsoever because you just have this dictatorship of the proletariat and there would be so much surplus and everybody would have ownership and all of the means of production. And so things would get distributed. And the way he described it was from each to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, right? Or did I flip that? From each according to their abilities to each according to their needs.
Yes.
All right. So that was the idea, and that sounds nice, right? You contribute based off of your abilities, and you take in accordance with your needs. Now, the number one issue that, if you think about this just for a second, is what sort of incentive structure is actually created in that sort of environment? Well, you get by having needs, and you are obligated to provide things based off of your abilities. And your abilities do not correspond with your needs. It's not that you get to keep or you get to produce or you attain wealth based off of your abilities or developing those abilities. In fact, the more abilities you have, the more will be expected out of you. And the more needs you have, the more you will receive. So what have you incentivized within that structure? Have you incentivized abilities or have you incentivized needs? Well, Marx went on to argue that, and again, it's not like they were totally oblivious to this, but what it was is that Marx recognized that what we were going to actually need to do is create this new socialist man, and that's why Marxism was actually very anti-family. Marx was very anti-religion, because he essentially explained everything within society, not just economically, but socially and politically, through this idea of class warfare, right? Workers of the world unite. All you have to lose is your chains. Capitalism, on the other hand, right, is a system which works off of the private ownership of the means of production and distribution. And generally what that means, and I'll read this off of Merriam-Webster, an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decisions and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. So let's put this in layman's terms, right? Capitalism is essentially you have ownership over your labor. You have the ability to acquire property. That property could be private property in the sense that, again, your toothbrush, your shirt and whatnot, but it can also be capital. You can use the property that you have to produce things and to cooperate and compete within the marketplace. And the better a job you do producing things that other people want, you actually do better from a wealth perspective within that marketplace, right? The better job you do meeting the needs, wants, and demands of other people through voluntary exchange. This is the part that's critical, and this is why cronyism is not capitalism. Cronyism actually relies on the government to come in and actually give advantages to people operating within what would otherwise be a market environment. So you're instituting coercion into that process. But in a free market system, the reason why your abilities are incentivized is because the better your ability to meet the needs of other people who can choose to do business with somebody else, the better job you do at using scarce resources in order to create the products and services that other people want, the more money you make, the more wealth you accumulate, right? Because people have to voluntarily give it to you. And then it incentivizes you to continue doing a good job within that field. The feedback loop within capitalism is customers who don't have to do business with you continue to do business with you because you're producing something that they want. Right? So the emphasis there is on your productivity, on your efficiency, on the use of scarce resources efficiently, as opposed, in comparison with others attempting to provide similar services. And so I would argue that the incentive structure within capitalism is far superior because it actually emphasizes your abilities and your productivity rather than just your needs. Because if I'm incentivizing your needs, well, then it pays to have more needs. It doesn't pay to have more abilities. But what we end up finding is that people's needs are better provided for when we put the proper emphasis and the incentive on developing your abilities and productivity.
Okay, so sure, it sounds like that this is a superior system. I'm teeing up a broader question, obviously. We all know, if you're watching this show or listening to this show, you know that capitalism is a superior system, right? So the question is, how on earth have we gotten to a point where 30 years after supposedly the triumph of capitalism over communism, you arguably have more Marxists. I will make this claim. You arguably have more Marxists in the West today than you did in the 1980s, 70s, 60s.
I think that's accurate.
50s, 40s. At any point post-revolution, post 1917, you probably have more Marxists in the West today than you ever have in the past 100 years. And what's more, a good chunk of them are Marxists, but a good chunk of them are Marxists without necessarily even knowing that they're Marxists.
Well, let's do that. Let's jump into this article by Heritage, and the title of the article was "How Cultural Marxism Threatens the United States and How Americans Can Fight It." So let's go ahead and go through this summary real quick and some of the key takeaways. So the summary says the United States has successfully confronted Marxist attempts to derail it from its historic path of liberty and order. The multifaceted effort to defeat the enemy, generally referred to as the Cold War, concentrated many of the best minds in the country. In 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, many Americans and others around the globe justifiably believed that communism had been defeated. However, American Marxists, making use of the complacency that victory often produces, have gained more influence than ever before. Cloaking their goals under the pretense of social justice, they now seek to dismantle the foundations of the American Republic by rewriting history, reintroducing racism, creating privileged classes, and determining what can be said in public discourse, the military, and houses of worship. Unless Marxist thought is defeated again, today's cultural Marxists will achieve what the Soviet Union never could: the subjugation of the United States to a totalitarian, soul-destroying ideology. Now, right off the bat, you can tell this is coming from Heritage, right? Heritage is very much a traditional conservative think tank.
Yeah, they're not hiding the ball at all.
They are not hiding the ball at all. They're telling you right up front what they believe, why they think this is wrong.
Yep.
And their key takeaways, here's the key. With the end of the Cold War, many Americans justifiably believe communism had been defeated. I guess this is kind of going over thing. That's the main point here, is the cloaking the goals under the pretense of social justice. And again, it's the overthrow of what we would consider to be the cultural, political, societal, and economic norms within the United States, which were largely influenced by Judeo-Christian values on a moral setting. It was largely influenced by what we would call classical liberalism, and by that we're talking about like John Locke, Montesquieu. The
founding fathers in the West, as well. In the
exactly.
US.
Jefferson, Madison, Washington, George Mason, Adams. And generally speaking, also free market economics. I mean, not perfectly so by any stretch of the imagination, but largely free market style economics.
Can I point out that we, in previous episodes, have talked about, to some degree, some of what we're talking about today, in more of a sense that we gave a precursor. This is in some ways considered basically a follow-up of the Bezmenov episode that we did.
Yeah. Well, and that's going to be one of the things, because Yuri Bezmenov essentially was saying that if you looked at active measures within the Soviet Union and what the KGB was attempting to do, it was a mechanism that they used to undermine a particular society that they then wanted to come in and, organically overthrow that government and then replace it with a Marxist regime, which would on some level be loyal to or an ally to or potentially dependent upon the Soviet Union. And so active measures is what Yuri Bezmenov talked about, that on how you essentially, demoralize a nation,
yes,
and then eventually take over its institutions.
The theory that I have is that Bezmenov was right ultimately in his analysis of what was going on. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, most people, understandably, who lived through it, such as yourself, thought, well, this is the end of this ideology. That goes into the dustbin of history. But in reality, the stuff that had been set in place, dating back to the 60s, in some ways dating back to like the 1930s with if you want to go back to Gramsci, that type of stuff, that kept going forward even though you didn't have a conductor at the train anymore. The Soviet Union wasn't around, the KGB wasn't around, but the stuff that the active measures that they've been pushing that we talked about in our previous episode on this, that kept going forward. And it took 30 years, but now the stuff that had been pushed that Bezmenov had warned about 40 years ago in the mid-1980s, that is finally coming true in a public sense. And I don't mean in an academic sense where it's like, oh, you do see it if you walk into a university.
Well,
you see it like plastered in public. You see it in some ways being pushed by corporate America even.
Well,
so
and here's what, and so if you look at the next thing in the article, it says 1989, the Soviet Empire was crumbling. The New York Times noted an interesting new development. While millions had lived under the brutal rule of communism for decades, were finally throwing off their yoke. Marxist professors were taking over American academia. And here's how this is the head of an article from the mainstreaming of Marxism in U.S. colleges. Said as Karl Marx's ideological errors in communist nations struggle to transform his political legacy, his intellectual errors on American campuses have virtually completed their own transformation from brash, beleaguered outsiders to assimilated academic insiders. It could be considered a success story for the students of class struggle who were once regarded as subversives.
this is from late October 1989.
1989. And then he goes, one such trend was that American Marxism was being liberated from Moscow's shackles. Indeed, communism's defeat in the Soviet Union and its captive nations behind the Iron Curtain seemed not to faze the Marxist academics Berenger quoted. I'm very happy with what's happening in these countries. I think it's going to save socialism rather than kill it, said John Romer, professor of economics at the University of California, Davis. So what was interesting...
Professor of economics, that's hilarious.
So what was interesting is that as most people were watching the Berlin Wall fall and the Soviet Union dissolve, what we were seeing is like, wow, this settled that, especially when you had people like Paul Samuelson, who's probably responsible for writing an inordinate number of textbooks on economics within your university system. Go read what he was writing about the Soviet Union, not in the 60s or 70s. Go read what he was writing about the Soviet Union in the late 80s. In the late 80s, Paul Samuelson was still predicting that the Soviet Union was going to overtake the United States economically by the early 2000s. He was still advocating for the powerful, centrally planned economy of the Soviet Union. And this guy wasn't just teaching on a single campus, right, or doing seminars. He was writing economic textbooks that were being broadly used within the university system within economics. And what's interesting about that is understand something. Most of like the Marxism that you've seen being pushed within the university system is not in the economics departments. And that is
we're
for a
going to get
reason.
to that in this episode.
For a
we are
reason.
going to there's one thing that Marxism did have in terms of being discredited in 1989, and it was the economic component. And that's why the type of Marxism that you see pushed in the United States is what we call cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to get into it right now or later in the episode, but that term, cultural Marxism, is basically a political landmine at this point, which is funny because it wasn't always a political landmine.
No, it was something that the left used to be fairly open about, with at least within academic circles.
If you asked them, they didn't necessarily push it in public.
And this roots again from Gramsci, and we'll talk about this, and the writings that he made while he was in a prison in Italy when the fascists had arrested him. And we'll go into a little bit more about what that theory was. I want to talk about something right before we do that, though, because I think this is important. Okay. And this is talking about where Marxism is thriving. He goes, where Marxism is thriving, these scholars say, is less in social science courses where there is a possibility of practical application than an abstract world of literary criticism. Now, why is that important? Well, I remember when I got out of the military, and I've told this story once before. I got out of the military. I'm going back. I've got my Montgomery GI, and so I'm finishing up my bachelor's degree. And I had to take some English classes, right? And now my overall degree, I was focusing on intelligence management because I was still doing work within the defense space. But you had to have so many English credits, so I'm taking this English class. And there's a class on English literature. Okay, and I'm thinking, great, we'll probably read through some classics and whatnot. And next thing I know, I'm being treated to Derrida, who was the father of deconstructionism. I'm being treated to Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto, which, again, I was already familiar with. But what was interesting is I'm sitting in this class, and I want you to picture this classroom for a second. Northern Virginia Community College, actually one of the most diverse campuses in the country, all right, which was a really cool place to actually take college classes. We probably had about 25, 30 students in there, and I would say the ages ranged from about 19 to 45. And at the time, I was in my early to mid 30s. And we're sitting there, we get the Communist Manifesto, and I'm like, okay, well, this is not what I would have expected in an English literature class, but let's see how this goes.
Had you read this book before then?
Yeah. So I'm sitting there, and we come into the class, and it's our time to discuss what that week's reading was. And this guy says, can someone tell me what their opinion of capitalism is? And I thought that was an interesting way to start off the conversation because we had just read Karl Marx. And this student raises his hand. He was a nice guy. We'd had conversations before. And he goes, I think capitalism is what's destroying this country. And I'm sitting here thinking, wait, what? And I said, I raised my hand real quick. I said, can you please qualify that statement? Like, can you tell me, what is capitalism? He goes, well, capitalism is this rigid base class structure where the people at the top hoard the resources. And I'm like, whoa, just for a second. Okay, I understand that that's how Marx saw capitalism. I'm asking, can you give me like an actual definition of capitalism? Professor jumps in. He goes, well, can you? I said, yeah, it's the private ownership of the means of production and distribution through a system of voluntary exchange. And he goes, okay, we can use that. I'm thinking to myself, what do you mean we can use that? Like, I didn't just make this crap up as I was driving into school that day. Like, this is the general understanding of what capitalism is. And so now the professor hasn't saved him, so he's looking at me. I'm like, so now that we have a definition, we have a working definition of capitalism that the professor and everyone accepts, can you tell me what the problem is with it? And he goes, well, I'm not saying I'm a communist. I'm just saying that the truth is somewhere in between. And I'm like, okay, well, 5 seconds ago, capitalism was what was destroying this country. And now it's just like, oh, the truth's somewhere in between. And this went on for the rest of the class. Like, he divided us into communists and capitalists, and we had a class debate. Now, I will say this. Once somebody was there to actually step up and defend some of this and talk about it and provide examples, that professor allowed for a debate to take place. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but I have no idea what would have happened if nobody there actually understood what capitalism was. Because I don't know if he was prepared to debate. I don't know. Like, there was a couple times during that class, same thing when Derrida came up, and he gave us this book to read on Derrida and deconstructionism. And the whole premise of the book was everything that the author puts at you, everything that you read, is an attempt to manipulate you into believing. It's a way that the author imposes their view on you using language.
Oh, really? Is that what? Sorry. Nick and I think alike. So I was about to spoil.
We're in this class. And he says all this, and I raised my hand. I said, does that apply to the author of the book? Does that reasoning apply to the author of the book who wrote this for us to read? And he's like, well, see, that is an interesting point. I'm like, no, that's not an interesting point. We've just pointed out that this is a horribly self-defeating statement. It is one thing to say that some people will use words in an attempt to manipulate you to believe something. It is another thing to say that all attempts to use words are some form of manipulation. And therefore not to be believed or understood, except for the author that's, of course, exposing this to you. When he writes it in words, that's different. That's special. You can trust him.
He's speaking truth to power.
He's a good guy. and I point all this out because, again, the more I learned about this, the more I realized this is rooted in Marxism. It's rooted in critical theory. It's rooted in the Frankfurt School. And we're not talking about it in even a sociology class. We're talking about it in an English literature class where you're theoretically far less likely to have people equipped to show up and debate sociology, politics, and economics.
So they considered it a soft target?
I think so, yes. And then let's read on this next part. He goes, the insight from Professor Weiner was important as it foreshadowed the identity-based Marxism of the 21st century. So we've already said, actually, let me go back a little bit. It says, but that still left them with the problem that workers in the West were refusing to wage a revolution that they intuited would hinder their own economic interests and diminish their freedoms. What he's talking about right here, just to kind of go back from this, I know I did that little segue into that story, is part of the question that's being asked here is, okay, why isn't this argument taking place in the economics departments? And why aren't the workers of the world uniting the way that Marx predicted? Because when you look at classical Marxism, he didn't think it was going to take place in a bunch of poor countries overthrowing, the aristocracy. He thought it was going to take place in a bunch of industrialized countries where the workers at the factories and whatnot were going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeois class and take over. But that wasn't happening. And in fact, if you look at the places where there's been Marxist revolutions, Marx predicted that it would be taking places in places like the UK, Germany, Italy, no, it was
mostly the UK and Germany, because Italy was only,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
in the 1840s, Italy was still mostly agrarian outside. What was worse about that was Italy hadn't unified, neither had Germany, but there were two large German power blocks, Prussia and Austria, that had started to industrialize. And so Marx, writing in England at the time, in the UK, he thought that Germany and the UK were the two prime places for a Marxist revolution. Once enough industrialization had taken place, the proletariat, who were working in the factories, would gain class consciousness, and then they would overthrow the system and seize power and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. Except when you actually look at 19th and early 20th century history, none of that happened.
Yeah.
Instead, the Marxist revolutions, and we brought this up in our previous episode about democracy, and I think we briefly mentioned this in the Bezmenov episode, the exact opposite happened. The revolutions took place in the unindustrialized agrarian peasant economies of Russia, the Russian Empire, and China, which were arguably two of the least industrialized countries on the planet that still had a large population that
that
had
size and scale.
a very rigid actual class structure of aristocracy ruling over unlanded peasantry. And so what happened is that people like Gramsci, writing in the West, he was in prison at the time, right? And he had a natural question, which is, why did I lose? And I asked this in the previous episode. Why did I lose? And Lenin and Stalin won.
Yeah.
And he made the conclusion that, well, in the West, they had industrialized, and rather than oppressing the proletariat and the workers, it had enriched them. And so why would the proletariat, why would anybody stage a revolution against an economic system that is increasing your standard of living and lifestyle? And so then he came to the conclusion, we need the long march through the institutions.
So the long march through the institutions was actually a phrase coined by somebody else, but it's interesting. So the point of what we're about to share next, you need to understand that.
Did you read this quote here from at the very end of this segment that you?
No, I'm about to read it. I'm about to read it. The whole point is that what Marx predicted didn't happen. But it wasn't that they didn't have communist revolutions. They did, just not in the places Marx expected. And Gramsci, who was, again, a socialist in Italy, he was in jail. Mussolini put him in jail. And Gramsci is sitting here trying to analyze why this is happening. And he came up with this whole concept of that essentially what had happened is that it wasn't just the material well-being of the people within a society, that those people, those workers, had been convinced through a whole host of cultural institutions that this was just the way it was. Right. And if they were getting better within their economic lot in life through industrialization and capitalism, that was all a good thing. And the religious institutions reinforced it, and your educational institutions reinforced it. And what it essentially became is like, I think he might have used this term or something similar to it. It was the idea of bourgeois common sense. So that when Marxists came in and tried to tell the factory worker, hey, you've got to throw off your chains, they're like, what are you talking about? Like what chains? Like I'm moving up the ladder. I've got upward economic mobility. Things are going pretty well. My streets are safe. I own a house. Like what chains am I supposed to be throwing off? Right? Or I own an apartment, whatever it was, right? When the worker in the West, in largely more capitalist driven free market societies, looked at the lot of the worker in socialist societies, they didn't see something they wanted to emulate. But Gramsci came to the conclusion that really what this was about was that bourgeois culture had so infiltrated every single institution of import within society is that it just seemed anything, Marxist doctrine just seemed ridiculous to those people. So it wasn't that Marxism wasn't producing the economic results it was supposed to, because remember, this is also in the 20s, 1920s. It's that these cultural institutions needed to be changed and adapted in order to reflect the Marxist worldview, and then it would be the competing common sense, right? It would be Marxist common sense versus capitalist common sense. And the problem they were having is all these people were operating within capitalist common sense, and there needed to be something that would compete with that. And that's where Gramsci was talking about, this is why people need to infiltrate these cultural institutions, education, media, academia, journalism, right? So here's what's important to understand. Everybody that tells you, well, when you talk about cultural Marxism, you're just a secret anti-Semite, no, they used to talk about it because if you think about it, it makes sense. put aside for a second that we don't necessarily like what they're trying to push. If you wanted to push a particular idea and it wasn't very popular within the general population at that time, how would you go about doing it? Well, you would become more influential in education, in academia, in journalism, in arts and entertainment. I mean, is that not what you would do? And here's what it came down to. The understanding that the economics was not going to achieve the Marxist revolution they wanted led them to understand something else. And here's where we get back into this paper. But that still left them with the problem that workers in the West were refusing to wage a revolution that they intuited would actually hinder their own economic interests and diminish their freedoms. Because of that, Marxism had to evolve to find other revolutionary agents. Marxism and feminism, Marxism and deconstruction, Marxism and race. This is where the exciting debates are, said the professor of history at the University of California, Irvine, Jonathan Weiner. The insight from Professor Weiner was important as it foreshadowed the identity-based Marxism of the 21st century. The struggle would no longer be based on economic class, but on identity, based on ascribed characteristics such as race, sex, or national origin that are inherited at birth and over which the individual has no control. The reasons were simple. Economic class fluctuate, especially under capitalism, where people can and often do change their situations in life. Race, sex, and national origin are, however, immutable. They are thus superior loci of revolutionary change.
We talked about this in the previous episode on how good old-fashioned Leninism had succeeded in a society where the overwhelming majority of people were peasants. And so you could appeal to the masses in the sense, I hate that term, but you could appeal to the masses and you could win them over by promising them, go with me and you will have higher status and power that you currently don't have. But in the West, which is much more diverse in terms of class and fluctuates a lot, and people who start off at the lower rung of the economic ladder many times will end their lives at the very top of the ladder or close to the top of the ladder. And so that message simply doesn't work. So what do? You replace good old-fashioned classical Leninism with an identity-based Leninism. This is why, and I postulated this in the previous episode, notice how the worse off a group or person acts, the more the left loves them. Mm-hmm. Think about that. Does the left love the nuclear family with the 2.3 kids and the family structure, and they go to church on Sundays and they work a stable job and they're not part of, the government welfare system or any? No, because they can't exploit that in order to obtain political power. Instead, the people, who they really love? They love the people that were burning cars in storefronts in the summer of 2020. They love the people in Portland and Seattle that were burning their own cities to the ground, Minneapolis as well. I remember the current vice president of the United States was sharing links for fundraising pages in order to provide bail for people that were literally setting cities on fire.
Yeah.
That's who this is not me just saying an outrageous statement without any sort of qualifications or evidence whatsoever. Kamala Harris went out there and she literally peddled fundraising movements to get these people out of jail after they had been burning cities down in the summer of 2020. I remember when there was a mob of people that tried to break into the grounds of the White House, and the Secret Service and the police in DC had to disperse them. Again, in the summer of 2020. And the left went out there and guess what they did? In the middle of lockdown season, they said, shut everything down except a protest. How many left-wing academics and scientists signed on to letters that encouraged rioting in the middle of you weren't allowed to go to church. You weren't allowed to go to a grocery store and pick up seeds for a garden. Going back into Michigan. Intentional communities and homesteading. Yeah, in Michigan, they taped those things off, but you were allowed to go into the streets and burn people's property. You could do that, and you would be applauded by the left for doing so. And if you got in trouble with the law, the future vice president of the United States would help bail you out. So when I say the left loves people who act the worst, the reason why is because they are outcasts in society. People that go out there and they burn people's cars and storefronts, they are the lowest tier in society. The rest of society views those people as scum of the earth. They're criminals. They're terrorists. And the left loves them. And the reason they love them is because those people in a normal, healthy society would never have power and status. They would be ostracized by the rest of society. And the left knows it. So they go to them and they say, support us, and we will give you the power and status that we know you crave and that you would never otherwise have. And now apply that to everything under the sun that you can think of.
Just look at when a trans activist shoots up a school and the commentary on the left and how they refuse to hold this person accountable the way they would hold anybody else accountable because they were trans. And they even acted as though because it was a Christian school that pushes Christian values, they had it coming.
How about the guy on that subway in New York City a few weeks ago?
Yeah. Well, and that's
look at how the left treated him.
Yeah, no, they treated him like he was just a murderer that just couldn't wait to kill somebody because of their skin color.
Think of the guy that he did kill.
Yeah.
That was like intimidating and attacking all these other subway goers.
Oh no, he was suddenly instead of
he became a martyr.
Instead of being a homeless man with serious mental health issues and a long criminal record who was currently wanted for punching, I think, an old woman in the face, all of a sudden he was a quirky Michael Jackson impersonator on the subway that was murdered by this white supremacist Marine. And you're looking at this going, none of the actual evidence that I've seen, the testimony from the other people that were there, even the videos that were available, none of the evidence that I saw suggests to me that any of that narrative is true. Like let's give that the best possible interpretation from a left-wing perspective. The guy acted too quickly, he choked him out too long, and he shouldn't have done that. Maybe some people would look at that and be like, yeah, this guy was just a little bit too aggressive, didn't know enough about what he was doing, and this person died as a result. But we also understand that, hey, him and the other people in the subway were scared. That would be like a reasonable interpretation from someone that still believed that the guy on the left or that the guy that choked him out was wrong. I watched people who I would otherwise think, oh, they're a reasonable person. We disagree on policy. No, he's a murderer. He's a murderer. And the reason why he's going to get away with it is because our society is so deeply rooted in white supremacy that when a white person kills a black person, there's no possible way they could be held to account. And you're looking at this going, this is clown world. I'm sorry, but 10 years ago, the vast majority of people that would have seen that would have said, this is tragic. All right, but we kind of understand that if you're going to go on a subway threatening violence against people, saying you don't care if you get shot, and there's people around that clearly cannot defend themselves, we would expect somebody that was capable of defending themselves and other people to step up and fill that role and to try to do so as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we would understand if something went wrong because that's an extreme circumstance. But no more. Nope. Half the country automatically knew what would happen. Why? Based off of the skin color of that person and the skin color and the economic and the mental health status of that other person. It didn't matter. None of the other facts of the case mattered because one was considered a marginalized person and the other is considered a privileged member of the oppressor class. And so you already know what you're supposed to think. The media already knows what they're dutifully supposed to report. Pop culture and Hollywood starlets already know exactly what they're supposed to think about this and the larger discussion that we're supposed to have. And facts be damned. And the individuals on there who, by the way, also might have been, who were minorities, who were women, who might have also fell into some sort of marginalized class structure. Doesn't matter how they felt about the situation. Doesn't matter that they may have been scared to death in that situation. Nope, none of that matters. They have spoken. You are a part of the oppressor class. You are a part of the marginalized class. And so you need to be punished. And anything that you did was simply a referendum on the greater society for either not providing you with housing or not providing you with health care or not providing you with the medication that you needed or not providing with the material wealth that you were somehow owed because you exist.
And it just so happens, lo and behold, who knew that according to the left's definition of who falls under oppressor and who falls under oppressed, it just so happens that just over 51% of society is oppressed.
Yeah.
Who knew? Like, by the way, the reason I bring that up is because if you want more proof that the worse off a person or a group is, the more lavish praise the left throws on them. Consider how the left treats the mentally ill homeless encampments in Seattle and San Francisco and Portland versus how they treat parents at school board meetings.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Parents are now domestic
think of,
terrorists.
Think of the approach that the left makes towards people that are shooting up on the sidewalk in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Versus how they treat a parent that shows up to a school board meeting that's upset about the fact that a trans-identifying student raped another student in a bathroom. And which is what happened in Loudoun County, actually, right before Youngkin won the gubernatorial race in Virginia in 2021.
Well, this is
like that. If that right there is not a perfect example of the truth of what I was just speaking to, and the reason why that's the case is because, as I said just a minute before, the left has created a narrative where they've picked out 51% of the population and assigned them oppressor status, and then go to them and then try to, some of them they're able to just bring on board immediately because they're already ideologically aligned with them, right? The rioters and stuff like that. But then some of them, they're not actually necessarily convinced that they're oppressed, because we live in a society where as long as things don't fall apart and the government doesn't mess things up, usually with each passing year, certainly with each passing decade, their standard of living is getting better in a free market society. And so a lot of people don't necessarily buy into the idea that they're being oppressed at all. So they have to be reinforced, or they have to be created, which is where I really think the quite frankly, the massive push that you've seen to enforce like trans ideology within schools. When I was in high school a decade ago, that wasn't the case. Mm-hmm. That simply wasn't the case. But now we actually have the numbers that show, I mean, increasingly it's like over a quarter of Zoomer women that are in high school or college identify as part of LGBTQ, XYZ, all the acronyms and numbers and pluses and minuses. And the reason why is because as a member of that group, you automatically are given oppressed status, which means you're automatically on the good side.
Yeah. For some people, it's the only way you can escape being an oppressor class.
You can escape being oppressed.
If you identify LGBTQ, because we're still not to a point where you can identify as a different race. Because I think even the left knows that that's problematic for them.
Oh, they're getting
close,
though.
Well, I think they know that's problematic for them with respect to their current coalition.
I don't know.
But
I mean, they don't
identity,
think that they don't see it, that it's problematic in the feminist movement, which is a huge base to have the patriarchy infiltrate the feminist movement and win all of the female competitions.
But the reason that they're pushing it so hard is because that group of people, the Dylan Mulvaney's and Leah Thomases of the world, in a normal functioning society, those people would not have their names branded on beer cans, right? And they wouldn't be winning NCAA trophies.
No, I'm not arguing that.
Leah Thomas is a loser in the men's category, and Dylan Mulvaney has literally nothing going for him ever. And
I'm not arguing that. What I was arguing is he was saying they are not doing that with race because that would be problematic. Well, don't give up just yet. They might, because they did with feminism.
No, but the point that I'm trying to make, though, is that they needed to do that because the feminist movement in and of itself doesn't give them the numbers, whereas dividing people by race gives them a lot of numbers. Not enough for them to get an absolute majority, but if they break everything down by society, and notice how they treat traitors to their own class that they're identified. Notice how the left treats
J.K. Rowling or...
No, notice how the left treats Thomas Sowell.
Yeah.
Or notice how the left treats Dave Rubin, who's gay. Yeah. Right? Any of these people that by rights, according to the left's own definition, their identity, their race or their gender or their sexual identity should put them into the oppressed status, but instead they align themselves with the right, or they align themselves with free market economics to some degree. Those people get just utterly, they get treated worse than, let me put it like this. Tina gets treated worse by the left than Nick does.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's true. Because she's considered a traitor because she's a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now again, she doesn't have sufficient.
I can't even tell you how many times I got called the C word when I was running for office.
Yeah.
It was insane. And obviously it was all leftist men.
Let me jump in with a question right here, if that's all right. Got a question from Chris. Would it be fair to say that Leninism and Stalinism was defeated by Marx, but Marxism and its social justice-based variants still live? Also, Webster's definition sounds more like an integrated community.
I would argue that Leninism was successful, whereas Marxism wasn't. Leninism and Stalinism were both, and when I say successful, that is not me saying they were a great system, we should replicate. I mean successful in the eyes of the people that were pushing for it.
But
right?
because of its success, it's now dead.
Well, no. Here's what remember what I said. The way that Leninism pulled it off in the Soviet Union is that he went to all of the outcasts within society. I mentioned this in the previous episode. This is like the 5th time I've mentioned it. In many ways, this is a successor to either the previous episode or the Bezmenov episode. But the way that Lenin pulled it off in the Soviet Union is that he went to all the outcasts within society, many of which actually were oppressed. The Russia before the Soviet Union, and especially during the Soviet Union, but Russia before the Soviet Union was an oppressive state. I mean, they had aristocracy that ruled over peasants, and serfdom had only recently been abolished. But he went to all those people. He went to the discriminated against ethnic minorities within the Russian Empire because it was a multi-ethnic state. He went to all the former serfs that were dirt poor and didn't have any power or influence or anything. They were just living on subsistence farming. He went to all of the soldiers that were getting shot to pieces by the Austrians and Germans on the Eastern Front of World War I. He went to all those people that were losing out, many cases through no fault of their own, and there were a lot of them that were losing out in Russia, and he said, join me and we will overthrow the system that is currently oppressing you. And it worked. Now, what followed was a complete catastrophe in terms of human rights, progress, development, economic growth, all that stuff. The Soviet Union was one of the most evil nations to have ever existed. But the reason they managed to pull it off was because the Russian Empire was not a utopia by any means. It sucked for a lot of people. And I say this as somebody who, I am Russian. I've got a German last name. My last name is Heinz, but I'm more Russian than anything else I'm actually more Italian than anything else because my grandmother, but my whole family on my mother's side were...
Way to go, whoa, Christian. You're an American. Get off that.
On my mother's
Burn
side,
the
though,
ship,
we all fled here from Russia during the Civil War.
Yeah, Leninism, Stalinism ultimately was defeated by the United States. I think that, or not just the United States, but it was ultimately defeated by, you call it the West or whatever you want. I think it really defeated itself because I think that there were certain perverse incentive structures in there that over time made it impossible to sustain. And one of the things that I do think Reagan understood in the 80s was that they did not have the economic capacity that they were actually saying that they could, and therefore they would not have the ability to sustain an arms race against the United States. Essentially, something would have to give at some point. And I think he was right on that at the same time that a lot of the economic experts, again, like Paul Samuelson, were Reagan's insane. He's going to drive us to nuclear war and the Russians are going to overtake us. And Reagan's looking at it going like, there's no way. And it's one of those things that's amazing to me that somebody that was not technically an expert on economics had it right and had it right for the right reasons, not just accidentally. And someone who was an expert, a lot of experts, had it horribly wrong about what the Soviet Union was actually producing within their economy. So that's a fair enough critique. The idea is, and this is where I think it gets to the root of the question, was if you look at the larger social critique just of society in general, and the fact that there are some people that have a lot, there are some people that have less or less. Some of that is due to exploitation. Some of it is due to choices, individual choices and opportunities within an environment. And it's really about understanding I think the nature of that. I think one of the reasons why academia has been so easy to convince a number of people, especially professional academics, that capitalism is evil and bad and problematic and unfair and leads to inequity, is because I think they see themselves as being highly intelligent and capable within their field, and yet that is not rewarded economically the way that other skill sets are within. Because the important thing, and so they look at that as like there's something unjust about that. I am a poet, I am an academic, I am a scholar, I write all of these papers, and I'm only making this.
I got a junk degree, and I have $100,000 in school debt.
Well, let's even assume they have a good one, right? And then they look at someone like, this filthy merchant Jeff Bezos on Amazon just exploiting labor. No, the difference is that capitalism and free market economics in general, right, doesn't reward you for having a bunch of degrees. Here's another thing it doesn't reward you for. It doesn't reward you for the difficulty of your work.
Yeah.
It rewards you based off of how much customers value what it is that you're providing. That's what it rewards you based off of. Well, it turns out for a lot of very, very upset English professors, what they are producing in their classrooms is not worth what Jeff Bezos is producing. It's not worth what millions of other people are producing. It just isn't, right? The demand for what they're supplying is not as high as they think it should be. And so clearly the problem is not with them and what they chose to do with their life or their inability to be happy with what their particular expertise pays on the economy or the free market. No. Clearly there's something wrong with civilization that values somebody kicking a soccer ball more than the incredible, contribution that they're making through their efforts within the classroom. Nope, sorry, it's not a problem with society.
They want power and status too. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, we want power and status,
they don't feel like they have it.
Capitalism doesn't give it to us because it doesn't properly reward us economically for our contributions. And it's like, okay, well, if capitalism is just another way of saying that free people are allowed to engage in voluntary transactions, the real problem that you have is there are not enough people that want to voluntarily purchase what it is you're selling, which is why I see so many people from the university show up to my office in Richmond talking about why they need more tax subsidization. And whenever I ask the very honest question of, so let me get this straight, you can't convince my constituents to voluntarily give you their money, so you would like me to take it from them because what you're producing is so valuable to society and they just clearly don't get it, that you need to have it taken from them and given to you. And that makes perfect sense to them. Perfect sense to them.
Hey, there's a question from, let's see, there's
one from Boston I want to get to real quick because I'm like, did we set ourselves up for this outcome with the actions taken in the Gilded Age? All right. Yes and no. And that's always a crappy answer, but
explain what the Gilded Age is in 30 seconds.
So the Gilded Age, when you think of the Gilded Age or the robber barons, this is where you're thinking of kind of like the highlights of like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie and Mellon and all these guys that were incredibly wealthy industrialists. And in some ways, they did attempt to manipulate the markets and attempt to manipulate education in order to, protect themselves. The important part is that that's the only side of this story that gets told anymore. It's like, oh my gosh, Rockefeller had all this wealth, and he exploited his workers. Okay, well, actually, Rockefeller got all of his wealth by making kerosene so cheap that poor people could afford it. Rockefeller gave away more money, I think, adjusted for inflation than I believe almost anybody else in the world ever, like to charitable institutions and everything else. You could say the same thing for like Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt actually gave away the least amount of his money of like Carnegie and all these other people. But then you start to look at their story. Okay, well, how did Vanderbilt start to get so wealthy? Well, it was because he was competing with a government-protected monopoly for the transportation of people in New York City across the water. And he actually did it cheaper than everybody else. In fact, for a while there, he did it for free, and he just sold food on his boats. And the reason why they called him Commodore was because he had built up this fleet, and he had done it by providing poor people a method of transportation cheaper than his competition. So the problem with the Gilded Age is that we look at it now, and there's been this reimagining of the Gilded Age to say, like, how horrible was it that these people were living in, like, complete affluence at the same time that their workers were struggling. There's a couple questions that are never asked. One is, okay, well, did they just hoard all the resources and sell kerosene for obscene amounts to only... No, he got wealthy by actually lowering the rates.
And they saved whales.
Yeah. Were his workers and living in squalid conditions? Some of them definitely were, but did their own lives improve? Yes, exponentially across this time.
A lot of times we look at the conditions back then and compare it to our poorest conditions now. And our poorest conditions now are so much better than the poorest conditions then.
Our poorest conditions now are better than Rockefeller's conditions over a century ago. For all of his wealth and power and all of that stuff, Rockefeller, the quintessential oppressor of the Gilded Age in the eyes of the left. And by the way, not a very well-liked person within the right in modern-day America either, because his last name is usually associated with left-wing political actors today, because the Rockefeller family has expanded outwards in the past century. But I think it was like his son or something like that died of an easily treatable disease today.
Yeah. Well, and there's other things too where you look at. I believe it was Carnegie, and one of the people that worked for him, the Jonestown or not Jonestown. Yeah, well, in Pennsylvania, they basically built like a levee in order to create like this wealthy country club that they all went to, and I forget the guy who owned it, but I'm almost positive he was associated with Carnegie, and Carnegie was a member. But they didn't actually provide sufficient protections on the levee. It broke, flooded, and killed. I mean, it was a horrible demonstration of somebody that was basically being completely irresponsible. And that has worked its way into the popular narrative as demonstrating that, look, these guys were all bad and this was bad and these were excesses of capitalism, without actually appreciating that the goods and products and services that they delivered drastically improved the lives of millions of people. One of the most important questions when they talk about the Industrial Revolution in England and whatnot, it's always this idea of, these poor kids that were working in the factories and all. They never ask the question, what would the kids have been doing if they weren't working in the factories? There's always this assumption that if they weren't working in the factories, they'd be making macaroni art. I got news for you. That was not the economic or social reality in the Industrial Revolution in 19th century England or anywhere else in the world.
Even now in developing countries where their children are working, there's child labor. People have this idea that, if we just get rid of the child labor, these kids are going to go to preschool and kindergarten.
No, what will happen is the family will starve.
No, what'll happen is that kid's going to get sold into the sex trade. Congratulations.
Well, and we actually saw this in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country roughly the size of Iowa with 180 million people. And everybody in the West was just incensed at the idea that there was minors working in sweatshops. And can I just be the first to say right now, yes, that is not ideal. That is not how we would like things to work. But here's what they found when they started shutting some of them down because that was cruel and evil, was mean. That didn't mean the kids went off to preschool. It meant the kids started panhandling, and in some cases, in some of the worst cases, sex trafficked. And then this is also known as something that has happened on this side of the world as well. Kids will get more money if they have a disability. So if they don't have one is created for them. They blind them. Right? So yes, is as horrible as it might be for us to imagine that a 12-year-old working in a shoe factory in Bangladesh is not a good situation. It's not an ideal situation by any stretch of the imagination. You better start looking at what the alternatives are for them before you start going around there and messing with it. Now, if you would like to come in and say, I want to provide my own plant where that's not going to be necessary and we're going to, great, wonderful. I encourage you to do that. I think if you can find a way to do that, that's awesome. That's excellent. But no, we don't get that. What we get is a lot of people that think, I know best. So let's get back to the original question here with the robber barons. The biggest thing that we have to blame for that I think the Gilded Age actually represents on this was the progressive era that actually stemmed up from around that. We talk a lot now about how Carnegie, fought for steel tariffs and how Rockefeller, really interfered in certain aspects of education that we don't like or in the government that we don't like. And perhaps the biggest one is the central banking. It's the, Jekyll Island.
The original question was
well, wait, let me finish.
No, I'm asking because I want to.
Do we have ourselves to blame for what's going on because of what happened during the Gilded Age?
Okay. All right.
So what I would say is that yes, the no part is producing cheap kerosene and cheap steel and cheap transportation. No, that wasn't bad for people. And it wasn't bad for people because not only did they voluntarily choose to purchase and use these things and actually help make the United States an industrial power, but people actually chose to work in these fields. And yes, there's some conditions that were just absolutely horrible and by today's standard would be exceptionally horrible. But compared to what is always the important question to ask, not to mention the fact that, again, that's the no. The yes part is those same industrialists got together, J.P. Morgan especially and others, and developed the whole concept of the Federal Reserve and greater central banking. They did end up fighting more and more. As the progressives fought for more and more government intervention into the economy, right, the industrialists also started to fight for interventions in the economy. So instead of just saying, hey, the government shouldn't be trying to micromanage the economy, they said, hey, we could actually benefit from this.
Just like today, people that invent great things, like, the people that came up and created ChatGPT, now they're going out there and saying, we need regulation.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? You create a new marketplace, with Standard Oil, and suddenly we need to regulate the oil industry. Or you create a bunch of railroads that outcompete government-run ones, and suddenly you've got a railroad empire across the entire country. We need more government regulation. It's the same story
all
fast
based on
forward
safety.
100 years.
Yeah.
We've been, it's on the economic side, that's been the same story for a long time, that a lot of times successful people within a new marketplace or industry, they do a great good to humanity and society when they invent something great or they create a new company or product. But a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times they then immediately turn around and then they try to pull up the drawbridge after themselves, using the government in order to be the drawbridge. But my answer to that question of do we have the Gilded Age to blame for this is an emphatic no. I don't think that the Gilded Age is responsible for this mess of this Heritage report that, outlines how at the same time that communism was falling in the East, it was being peddled in the university system in the West. Fast forward 30 years later, and now we're seeing the fruits of that in the form of cultural Marxism in the West. And I don't care what they say, that is the term that needs to be used for it. We should not allow the left to dictate what words we use in order to describe things that are actually happening. But the reason I say no is because ultimately, if you want to get deep into the weeds, and we won't, but ultimately I blame more like the French Enlightenment, the French Revolution. I'm much more in the Burkean school, where I view things like the French Revolution as actually a mistake. Not because I'm pro absolute monarchy, but because I think Burke had the answer to the problem, and there's a reason that he himself had became a conservative. He was a liberal at the time, and then he became a conservative when he saw the revolution take place. So that's my answer to it. But Nick, I know that you wanted to go through this a little bit more.
Yeah, we need to get to some of this here. So again, answering that question, going back to kind of the central theme here of the difference between traditional Marxism versus the kind of cultural approach that Gramsci took. Here's where we're getting this. Gramsci, the founder of Italy's Communist Party, was one of the first to propose a solution to this conundrum. The conundrum was, why aren't industrialized nations throwing off the yoke of bourgeois oppression, right? He argued that workers had accepted the cultural institutions of their bourgeois oppressors and therefore effectively imposed their own enslavement on themselves. Gramsci wrote that the worker had developed a false consciousness. The worker remained faithful to God, loyal to his family, patriotic to his nation, and he liked his private property, all things that Marx had said needed to be abolished. As Marcuse wrote years later in his essay on repressive tolerance, false consciousness has become the general consciousness. Why is this important? Gramsci is laying the groundwork, right? Gramsci is laying the groundwork for infiltration into the institutions in order to create a competing narrative, right? Marcuse was one of the leading thinkers within the Frankfurt School and critical theory. Okay, Gramsci argued they should undertake a war of position or hidden conflict. So communists originally were on this whole idea of war of maneuver. The war of maneuver is like the violent revolution, right? That's kind of the... Again, Gramsci's saying no, war of position or hidden conflict. The supposedly oppressed groups would gain influence and power by taking over existing institutions. It would be the job of communist intellectuals to undermine the state's hegemonic narrative and introduce into the minds of the people a counter narrative. So think of that counter narrative as a counter common sense. So when you're looking at this stuff going on saying, this doesn't make any sense. Why would we as a society lift up people that are running around a subway shouting at people and threatening to hurt them, and then punish somebody that attempted to stand up and prevent them from actually engaging in a sort of violent behavior? Why would we demonize somebody that's providing products and services and then lift up people that are marching through the streets violently rioting and setting those places on fire? Why would we do those things? It doesn't make sense. Well, what they're saying is, no, it doesn't make sense within your bourgeois mindset, but it certainly makes sense within this mindset, because everything around you is inevitably perverse. It is all built up to support the bourgeois oppressors. And so it all has to come down. It's not good enough that you overthrow an economic system, because they've recognized that the economic system outperforms theirs. They have to overthrow the other things as well. Again, stop looking at this as being just crazy nonsense. It's not.
This is why
it makes perfect sense within their worldview.
This is why and Nick, you have a story on this. I don't know if you want to bring it up right now. At some point, you definitely need to, because Nick was sharing a story with us before we started recording of people on the right, supposedly on the right, that constantly get mad. And if you're watching or listening to this, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where you hear people that say things like, I'm tired of the culture wars.
Yeah.
How often have you heard people that aren't on the left, that are either in the center, especially centrists or moderates, that say that, all the time. But I hear people on the right that I know people in Virginia politics that I've known for years, a decade even, that will go out there and say on Facebook or Twitter, like, oh, I'm just sick and tired of the nonsense BS culture wars. Brother, I don't know why you're in politics then.
Yeah.
Because guess what? It's not like we started this. There's a culture that exists, that has existed and been refined through thousands of years of tradition that has led us to what we had until the left started chipping away at it.
They just want us to surrender.
It's a culture centered around a family unit. It's a culture centered around worshiping things beyond the material world, which Marxism pushes hardcore with their whole historical materialism. Yeah. We historically, the West has been more enthralled with either dualism or idealism, not materialism. Historically, the West has been built around marriage, not polygamy, and not promiscuity. Historically, the West has been built around family units, not the state controlling people's children and raising them up to be Romans. That's what the West has been built around, what we would call Judeo-Christian values in terms of social and religious institutions, and on the economic side, built around free market capitalism. That is Western culture. And the left, that was the default. And it was a very successful default. It still is. I'm acting like it's gone. It's not. They're trying to get rid of it, but it's not gone. And yet, the left comes along, people like Gramsci and everybody after him over the past century, they've tried to just completely gut that. And we've seen it in so many ways. The data is so clear. Look at the marriage rates. Look at the divorce rates. Look at the number of children being born out of wedlock. Look at the rise of mental illness. Look at the number of men falling out of the workforce. All of these things are indicative of the fact that the culture is rotting. And when people point that out and say, yeah, this is a problem, maybe we should address this, we're the bad guys for that?
Yeah, because the culture war is going to be waged no matter what, because they are waging the culture war. And whether or not you fight back or not is the real question. And some of these people that are more on the moderate side, like you were saying, they would rather us just put up our hands and quit. I mean, since when did we become French, you guys? This is insane.
No, look, let's get into this on how this has gone in the university. So on page 7, it says a key moment came in 1960 when C. Wright Mills, an influential sociologist at Columbia University, wrote a seminal article titled Letter to the New Left, which appears to have provided a name, the New Left, or a movement that wanted to bring about radical change, but independently of Moscow. He dismissed the Soviet focus on the worker as Victorian Marxism and even vulgar Marxism. Instead, Mills wrote, who is it that is thinking and acting in radical ways all over the world, in the bloc, outside the bloc, and in between? The answer is the same. It is the young intelligentsia. He recognized that in many places around the world, it was not workers, but young people who were in fact sparking revolution. And by highlighting that fact, he provided inspiration to a generation of middle-class white students in the United States that they could be agents of revolutionary change. And what I think is really fascinating is that you go down a little bit farther in the article, and there's this article on Fidel Castro at Harvard, how history might have changed. And he said, so Castro was invited to speak, and Castro explained that he agreed to speak at Harvard because that is where you find the real military spirit, in students, not in the barracks. It should come as no surprise that within 3 years of Castro's visit, Harvard's chapter of SDS would have 600 dues-paying members and the mission of shaking America to its roots. Now, again, this is the part where we look at stuff like this and we say, okay, we have a combination. I want to talk a little bit about Yuri Bezmenov right now for a moment. Okay. Because one of the big things that we get shamed of when we bring up cultural Marxism, or we bring that a lot of this was organized, is this idea that we're treating reality as if there's some sort of Bond villain out there that is secretly, working all the different threads within the cultural institutions, and it's the KGB, or it's this, or it's that, or it's the WEF. Let me just say something real quick right here, at least for what my position is. That's not what I'm claiming.
Not that the WEF are a bunch of good guys. We've done an episode on them before.
I'm not claiming that there's some sort of secret Bond villain out there pulling all the strings. What I'm saying is that for a while there was large, government-backed institutions and operations that were designed around doing some of this stuff. I don't think that they were necessarily successful in and of themselves. What I think is that this is an idea, and this idea is rooted in something of a rejection of what we've kind of considered traditional Western values around, and they're not even, exclusively Western, but rooted around the idea of, the family as the base unit of society, of individual rights rather than collective rights, negative rights rather than positive rights, the idea of freedom of inquiry, the idea of the scientific method, the idea of the laws of logic. All of these things were kind of rooted in this classical
Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah, Judeo-Christian values as the basis for our morality. These for the last several centuries have essentially made what we think of when we think of the West. And when they tried to get workers to revolt, it didn't work, and so they focused more on the students. And when you've got people like Castro, when you've got people like Yuri Bezmenov explaining what active measures was in the Soviet Union, do I think that all contributed to laying a foundation, especially because it provided something to point to and something from which to get resources from? Absolutely. Do I think it's still controlling? Do I think there's some sort of cabal of KGB agents? No. I think what happened was, and Christian, you've kind of elaborated on this before.
It's an organic process.
Is that it is very much organic. There was a lot of people that were already sympathetic to Marxism. And just like that one college professor said, when the Soviet Union fell, they actually considered it a good thing because the Soviet Union represented something that was largely seen in the West as bad and oppressive. And now they had the ability to decouple the theory from what was at that time the leading proponent of it. They got to actually do a rebranding when the Soviet Union dissolved. And so the efforts that were already taking place within academia were now freed from the shackles of Moscow. But it's not like they changed what their overall worldview was. And so I think that's what's important to understand about this. And then that move from economic focus, Marxist theory that this is all about economics, to no. Identity is a far easier way. Identity, race, immutable characteristics. That's a far easier thing. And if you look at things like the Port Huron Statement in the United States and the rise of socialists and communists within American academia, a lot of what they kind of glommed onto was the civil rights movement. Because there was a legitimate issue there that had to be addressed. There were horrible things going on in the United States rooted in racism and sexism. And they were institutional and they were systematic and they needed to be underdone. And they recognized that if they co-opted this movement, not only would certain things be achieved that I think I would hope the vast majority of us believe are wonderful and good, such as greater equality before the law and greater ability to participate within the American experiment and not holding people back based off of their race or their sex. But then they moved it into, and that is also, they didn't want to just remove the barriers of the bad things that were happening. It was also, this was an opportunity to create things like the Great Society, where now the government was going to play a far larger role in the distribution of resources. And so I when I look at all of this, I'm like, okay, it's not hard for me to see where cultural Marxism has had successes within American society, and some of even the reasons why they had successes within American society that were not necessarily tied to Marxism as an economic theory, but Marxism as an overall social theory.
Oh, I know that it's had successes. And you know why? Here's the proof.
I'm not saying they haven't. I'm saying I understand why they've had some of those successes.
The proof. Fair enough. And it's true, and I agree. But the proof that cultural Marxism has been as successful as it's been in the United States is the fact that you're not allowed to critique it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's the proof. Look at what happens when you use that phrase in public.
Yeah.
What do you get called?
Oh,
you get called a racist, a white supremacist.
It's not that you're just not allowed to critique it. You're not allowed to notice it.
And when you look it up now, we've talked about this before the episode, where like the current Wikipedia article on it has it associated with anti-Semitism along with a huge drop-down info box of all the other related articles with anti-Semitism, like Holocaust denial.
Yeah, actually,
like
let's
look at this. Is the current Wikipedia article where they say it's part of a series on anti-Semitism.
Yeah, let's bring this up now.
Unbelievable.
Let's bring this up now because I think this is important.
And they call it a conspiracy theory.
I had somebody when I was in an election, and somebody was asking me, at a fundamental level, what do you think is one of the greatest things threatening the United States? I said, well, I think it's cultural Marxism. And by cultural Marxism, what I meant was everything that we've just described. It's the writing of Gramsci's and Marcuse and Derrida and some of these other people that believe that if you look at the Western traditions, which inform the United States, were fundamentally wrong, evil, and a part of oppressive bourgeois culture, and therefore needed to be overthrown. And the way that was going to happen is through what Rudy Duschke, who was a West German radical, coined the Long March through the institutions, and he got the idea for the Long March with Mao's Long March when he was fighting the communist revolution in China. So that's the spirit in which that comment was intended. And I had, quote unquote, centrist Republicans basically taking me to task for using that term. Now, what's interesting is that term was not considered offensive, for all time. It was certainly not coined by anti-Semites. I mean, the Nazis talked about cultural Bolshevism, but this idea that Marxism being an integrated or an integrated component within the culture, not just an economic or political system, that was not that. It wasn't white supremacists that came up with that. It was communists. They're the ones that came up with it. And so I want to point this out real quick. In fact, let's just bring up the video because there's this one YouTuber. Go ahead and bring it up. It's the third one right there. And he was talking about this, Antonio Gramsci and the socialist intellectual ecosystem. And the YouTube page is called Short Fat Otaku. I'll tell you what, the guy actually, he does some really, really interesting videos. But we found this one especially interesting. It had about 7 chapters and then an epilogue. But we're just going to listen to a portion of his chapter on cultural Marxism. And the reason why we're going to talk about this is because everything that we've just explained, we've tried to be faithful, to the intention of it. We've tried not to create this is some sort of boogeyman. It's just people with a different ideology that are attempting to change the composition of the United States, and they feel they're doing something morally good and justifiable. But they've understood, because they believe in Gramsci's teaching, they've understood that you're not going to have a violent overthrow in the United States based off of the workers revolting. That's not a thing. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen.
By the way, if you pull this video up or anything from this guy, he's super spicy with language, you guys. And so hopefully we have cut this in a spot because he says something really out of pocket let's before this.
Let's just do language alert. We tried to, okay, but the point of all of this is that, again, this is happening. They used to be proud of it. Now that it's moving so quickly within society and there's something of a societal backlash in the United States, all of a sudden they're pulling back from some of it. And we've seen this before. How many times have you been told, hey, I don't like that this is going on? That's not going on. Yes, it is. Here's the evidence. You must be a white supremacist. You must be a racist. How dare you not want drag queens to perform at schools?
First, it's how dare you believe your eyes. And then when you say, no, I see it with my own eyes, then how dare you have a problem with it?
The incantations must be recited by the left in order to, think about it. The reason that they will just throw out white supremacy, racist, anti-Semite, homophobe, transphobe, all the phobes, right? The reason that they throw those things out is not necessarily because they think that it's true all the time. Yes, there are people out there that those words you could accurately use to describe somebody. But the reason that they throw that out there towards people that might not actually fit any of those categories is because they have to reinforce the oppressive power structure narrative.
Yeah.
And so when somebody like Nick uses a phrase cultural Marxism to complain about certain things that certain elements of the left are doing, again, not in a conspiratorial way, but in an organic way, Nick gets called a white supremacist because he's a white man. They have to reinforce this idea that the boogeyman over here is coming to take your rights away and send you back to the 1950s or 1850s.
Yeah.
And if you don't follow us and you don't vote blue no matter who, evil, mean, greedy, power, oppressive people like Nick will take over, even though the fact that if Nick actually took over, he would just... Nick would be the most... Nick would be the worst dictator in American history because his entire political philosophy is built around letting people be free to live their lives the way that they want to. So, Nick, I know you wanted to play this.
So let's. So again, just to give you the basis, he's addressing the whole concept of cultural Marxism and the way that the left and is now treating it. So let's go ahead and hit play.
Entire article when he says conservatives are lying and grifting because they claim Gramsci said something he didn't say, even though socialists still believe in all of the underlying ethics anyway. I hope this is the final nail in the coffin regarding any assumptions of good faith on his part, or at the very least, that he actually reads any of the theory that he cites. There is a clear lineage from Antonio Gramsci to the present day. And the craziest thing about it all is, when I took that 2007 class, this stuff wasn't exactly kept secret, but it wasn't being shouted from the rooftops either. My professor made it clear that this was very serious, very subversive stuff, and while it wasn't to be kept under wraps, it was meant to make us critical theorists. He was clear about viewing his class as a political project, his contribution to the creation of counter-hegemony. It's only after my generation, the millennials, left university, entered the workforce, and began to implement this shit that wider society began to take notice, and the subversives began to panic. Here's one example of what I mean. If you go to the Wikipedia article on cultural Marxism, you'll get this passage. The term cultural Marxism refers to a far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory which claims that Western Marxism is the basis of continuing academic and intellectual efforts to subvert Western culture. The conspiracy theory misrepresents the Frankfurt School as being responsible for modern progressive movements.
Okay, pause right there.
How does that misrepresent that Frankfurt School is responsible for modern progressive movements? That's the thing I don't understand about even the way that the article is currently written. The idea that the conspiracy theory misrepresents the Frankfurt School as being responsible for modern progressive movements, identity politics, and political correctness. Where else do those things come from?
Well,
they didn't just pop into the void and quantum fluctuations. Like they had a source. Seriously, think about this entire article. By the way, I say this as somebody who has over 20,000 Wikipedia edits, mostly about the Austro-Hungarian Navy. But that's point is that I know how Wikipedia works. I was an editor of Wikipedia for over a decade, and again, I've got over 20,000 edits and the reason that I never touched political topics, despite the fact that, as you can tell, I'm very into politics. I've worked in politics my entire life, but I spent my Wikipedia career writing stuff not related to politics. And the reason why is because Wikipedia is a great source for non-political topics. If you want to learn about an obscure historical fact, like the stuff I've wrote about, it's relatively reliable. But if you want to know anything about politics, Wikipedia is completely dominated by people on the left that, quite frankly, I don't even think they realize the intellectual inconsistency of what they're writing here. They want to present this as a conspiracy theory, and an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory at that, even going so far as to throw it alongside part of a series on anti-Semitism and throw the Nazi Jewish yellow star of David alongside the article, making it sound like that this is this is the equivalent of Holocaust denial.
Yeah.
And yet when you read this article, it's nonsensical.
Well, let's go. Let's do this. Click over to the next link.
Well,
wait. Click over to the next link. This was the Wikipedia article. The next one.
Oh, are you done showing the video then?
Yes,
because he goes into it.
This is not.
I know, he goes into it. I wanted the other article. If you had,
I can pull it up. If you give me a minute.
Pull it up. So in the rest of the video, and again, I'm trying to be. I'd like to show the rest of the video. The reason I'm going to nod is because of the language.
Okay.
But he actually brings up the Wikipedia article that was written on cultural Marxism in 2014, and lo and behold, the one written in 2014 essentially just goes through and explains what cultural Marxism was. Because, again, there wasn't this attempt apparently in 2014 to hide what it actually was. And part of what I think is interesting about this is it's almost as if American society has been kind of going off on these two rungs where you got academia over here doing like crazy stuff. And most people just, hey, academia is the place where you're supposed to kind of, especially college, right? That's essentially what we're talking about. That's the place where you're supposed to look at a variety of different ideas. And of course, you're going to have some quirky professors and you have some quirky students. And that's just a part of the experience. And it's a part of understanding, maybe challenging different things that you had to adequately challenge before. And then all of a sudden, one day you wake up and you find that, that whole separate culture, that whole separate common sense that they've been talking about actually exists in a place, and it's called academia. And now the people are leaving that environment, and they're actually bringing that culture with them. They're actually bringing that common sense with them. And what was fascinating about the article that he, again, juxtaposing the two articles, both from Wikipedia, but there was a difference in time between the two. And one was just an accurate reflection of what cultural Marxism represented. And oh, by the way, it mentioned the Frankfurt School. And oh, by the way, it mentioned
Here
Gramsci.
it is. Here's the link from, this is as late as 2020.
Yeah. So it wasn't that long ago.
This is what the article used to look like.
So you heard what the new cultural Marxism article looks like. It's all just part of a series on anti-Semitism. Here's what it used to be.
Conspiracy theory.
Here's what it used to be. Cultural Marxism is a social theory and movement derived from Marxist historiography that seeks to examine and judge all ideas in culture based on their relation to power, believing that cultural artifacts, productions, examples given are books and institutions, and ideas are representations of elemental power structures. In essence, it follows the theoretical framework that culture, ideas, religious beliefs, values, is fundamentally determined by one's position in a social or class hierarchy. In other words, per the traditional Marxist sense, the superstructure, culture, is in some way a mere expression of the base, relations, and means of production. So you see how it wasn't that long ago that if you wanted to understand what cultural Marxism was, you could go to Wikipedia and this would pop up when you looked for it. And it would just basically give you an idea of, And look at the bottom. When you read more into this article, they're going to talk about the Frankfurt School. They're going to talk about Gramsci. Why? Because all of these people and institutions didn't see anything wrong with this. They thought this is what we should be doing. This was the response to the fact that the workers were not rebelling in these industrialized capitalist societies. And this is how you were going to get them to see that they were basically subject to oppression that they couldn't quite see, couldn't quite feel, but trust them, it was actually there. Right? How do you explain what's going on right now where in the United States, even with all the problems that we have, right? You are still living at a time and period in history where you have greater wealth, prosperity, security, access to goods and services, upward economic mobility, property at any time in human history. At any time in human history. And yet you will have people believing that they are truly living in just the worst, most oppressive society. I mean, there's no way they can achieve anything because of systemic and institutional oppression.
Well, I think there's a really good indication as to what exactly happened. And that is when earlier Christian pulled up who edited and changed this, who put out the new article. So can we go ahead and pull that up?
I know how Wikipedia works, and the vast majority of people, they never go to all the other hidden pages on Wikipedia. You've got the main articles, but there's a million internal pages on like guidelines and rules and discussions. There's talk pages where people talk about a topic, and then people have user pages. And I found, because I know how this works, I pulled up the three top editors. Hamilton, you're going to want to scroll down because there's a quote here. The three top editors of the current Wikipedia article on cultural Marxism, the conspiracy theory
the new one, the gaslighting one.
Yeah, the gaslighting one. Here's what some of these people, these are the three editors of the site. This first one, their person's name is David King. They decided to quote themselves on their user page. Everybody who edits Wikipedia has a user page. Some people, they don't put anything on it and they just leave it blank. Other people, they decorate it. They make it look nice and pretty. They explain like what their interests are, what they do on Wikipedia. Like my user page, I have a lot of stuff where I talk about my interest in like naval history and stuff like that. And I have like, pictures of paintings on that topic.
Yeah. Do you quote yourself at all?
No, I don't quote myself, unfortunately.
Shocking.
But this person quotes themselves. This is from a debate that they were having with somebody else about their editing style. This person's a hardcore leftist that apparently lives in Italy. Their quote is imagine thinking that rejecting all involuntary coercive forms of hierarchy and supporting the claim that human development flourishes when individuals engage in cooperative, mutually respectful relations that can thrive only when excessive differences in status, power, and wealth are eliminated are bad things. This guy's a Marxist. Yeah. At his core, he's a Marxist.
Again, it's the mutually, because when you look at a lot of that, you're like, oh yeah, I don't got a problem with getting rid of involuntary coercive forms of hierarchy. And sure, human development flourishes when individuals engage in cooperative, mutually respectful relations. But then he goes to this part, that can thrive only when excessive differences in status, power, and wealth are eliminated. What's an excessive difference?
Oh, anything that goes against what they're saying. And, we all know how communists deal with excessive differences. It's usually the barrel of a gun.
And here's a question. Is there an excessive difference between the status, power, and wealth of a doctor versus a serial killer? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Are those good differences?
And one could argue that the serial killer is the marginalized of the two.
Yeah. All right. So that's David King. Show us another one here, Christian. Who's
All
another?
right.
Oh, this one's better.
One. This is the next one. This is, again, the 3 most edited writers of the current article.
His handle is New Impartial. Impartial. Then look at all of his little decorations.
All of it. They call these barn.
Is it?
Sorry. They call these. What do they call? It's been years since I've been on Wikipedia. They don't call them barn stars. Those are awards that people give. They're like tags that you can put on a user page to, say like what your interests are.
I'm sorry, this person is
name,
non-binary, and I was saying he. I'm so sorry, they.
So
them.
the name of this editor is New Impartial, and they've got all these little banners that they put on their page to kind of identify. Think of it as them wearing ribbons.
They're
right?
queer.
Or putting.
Let's read it out. This user identifies as queer. This user is a feminist or into feminism. This person is neurodivergent. Okay, and they're LGBTQ studies, whatever. They have ADHD. Okay, well, join the club. Non-binary, and they like to play role-playing games.
And user has been diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder.
Avoidant personality disorder.
I mean, look, I'm not making fun of stuff, but it's just okay. Go on to the next one.
No, the top 3 ones there.
Yeah, go on the
this
next
explains why we're
Here's
all
the
getting
next one.
gaslit.
Yeah,
Here
and
we
then
go.
Senilin. This user's pronouns are she, her, hers. This user likes impossible objects. This user knows that Black Lives Matter. The bottom line is everyone editing this new article,
they're all hardcore leftists.
Is essentially they're hardcore leftists. Now, nothing wrong with them being able to and edit articles the way they want. But again, what I find interesting is every single time something like this is done and we point it out, we're told that we're crazy for noticing it. And then when we prove the receipts, or it's that whole what's the old trope with that one? It's like that is not going on, and I'm glad that it is. Like, wait, which is it? It's not going on, or you're glad that it's going on? But this is what we keep running into. So the bottom line of showing you this.
The patients have taken over the asylum now, and they're editing Wikipedia.
Yeah, bottom line is that you need to understand that when you use certain terms, especially when those terms hit really, really close to the target, instead of someone engaging with you and saying, well, actually, this is why I think cultural Marxism is a good thing, or this is why I think the long march for the institutions is good, or this is why I think Gramsci was correct, you're just going to be called a racist, a bigot, and a sexist. And it's because inherently on some level they know that society at large doesn't want what they're pushing. Does not want what they're pushing. And this is where we get into how do we deal with all of this? And how do we respond to all of this? When you start seeing things being changed, when someone gets a little bit too loud in the public square and then all of a sudden they back off a little bit, when somebody starts saying, hey, I don't like that this is going on, and someone says, that's not going on, prove it, and then you prove it, and they either get quiet or they start accusing you of something, when there is no longer a common basis for you to actually engage, because again, you would think if they're saying this isn't, nobody's chopping up little kids for transition surgery. Nobody's doing that. Really? Here's over 1,000 cases last year in the United States where they did just that. So are you now going to come back and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I did not realize that. And I agree with you. That's inappropriate. Has that ever happened?
Nope.
Once. Has it ever happened where somebody said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that there was a drag queen giving a lap dance to a 10th grader? You're right. That's inappropriate, and that shouldn't have. Just like a heterosexual person shouldn't do this as a lap. Neither should a drag queen. I didn't realize that happened. That's wrong. And even if they wanted to caveat and say, however, I don't believe that that's representative of the community as a whole. Okay, but we can agree that's wrong, right? No, we can't.
Nope.
They will not give an inch. They will not give an inch. It will immediately go to you're the problem. Why are you even paying attention to these culture wars? Why am I paying attention to the culture war? I'm not somebody that got a full-grown adult to dress up and give a lap dance to a child. That was your side. I'm now showing you your side's doing some stupid stuff. You might want to rein that in a little bit. And your response is you're the problem for noticing. What you need to understand is that the person that you're engaging with believes in this, but they're smart enough to know that the vast majority of people do not. They're smart enough to know that you're not quite ready for this. Right? And that's why all of a sudden the gaslighting starts and the diversion starts and the name calling starts, because they know. So I just want to make that very clear. I want to move on to some other stuff here. We've already talked about.
Somebody asked, like, how do we answer that? It was way early in the chat, and they said, what is our answer to that to get them to stop in their tracks? And my answer to that would be, when you allow yourself to be shamed into silence with their tactics, that's when you've lost. You absolutely have to stand up to it, because a lot of times they have no idea what to do with themselves and will completely, like, straight up lose their crap the minute you stand up for yourself. And that's when they become unhinged, and then everybody can see them for the crazy psychopath that they are.
When we get to the end of the episode, I definitely want to ask have Nick answer the question of, like, what do you do to this? Because it's demoralizing, to be honest. And you know what? It's intentionally demoralizing, because the whole idea here is to tear down existing culture and replace it with something that, quite frankly, if you're watching this podcast or listening to this podcast in the car, you probably don't want what they're offering. That's why you're listening to us. You probably agree that, the last 3,000 years of history has resulted in the creation of a culture that's relatively decent, and I don't want to get rid of it.
Let's go ahead and then move on to the whole, like, what do you do about this? So at the end of this document by Heritage Foundation, they actually have they talk about kind of the infiltration within institutions, education, corporations, investments, sex and gender, all that stuff, right? And I think all of us are seeing the climate, and all of us can easily recognize that, when Bud Light is running the sort of advertising campaigns it is, when Target is running the sort of advertising campaigns it is, we're looking around going, okay, this is like crazy world. It's not as if we were expecting those institutions to reinforce maybe our political views, but we didn't expect them to come right out and be hostile to ours as well. Like the Los Angeles Dodgers. And for those of you who don't understand, I grew up watching the Dodgers because when my parents got divorced, my dad was LAPD, lived in Southern California. I went down there for the summers, and I rooted for the Dodgers. Like I've been a Dodgers fan since like 87. And I could sit there and I could tell you the whole starting lineups for the years the Dodgers were in. I collected the baseball cards. I went to the games whenever I could. I listened to them. I watched them. I love listening to Vince Scully. I'm done with the Dodgers. I'm done with the Dodgers because they decided they didn't just decide indulgence, and their whole motto is go and sin more. Yeah.
And I saw a video of these people. This is part of what a lot of just decent human beings are looking at and saying, this is disgusting. I mean, I can't imagine the desecration of any other religion being acceptable in our society. But for some reason, it's okay to do a pole dance on a cross on which they did a mock crucifixion of Jesus. Some guy's on there. And this other guy is on top of it with these like stiletto heels, like swirling around him like it's some kind of a pole dance on the cross around this mock of Christ.
Yeah, this is a very public display.
Disgusting, vile. And can you imagine them doing this with any other religion whatsoever? No.
Oh, I'm sure they're going to do that with Muhammad next.
No, yeah, right.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not, right? No, but the reason why I laid all that up is because as I look at something that, again, for me was a politically neutral institution that actually provided some sort of way for people of differing viewpoints, experiences, backgrounds to actually come together and root for something together. That's one of the things that sports used to provide within our society, is that you could sit down at a ball game with people that of a variety of different backgrounds and economic stations and status, and you had something that unified you. And now the Dodgers have decided that not only are they going to go double down on everything with pride, but that they were actually going to invite a group and honor them. That was part of what this was. They were honoring this group, a group that goes out of its way to be especially offensive toward Christianity in general and Catholicism specifically. And I'm looking at this going, I'm
and
done.
They think they can clean it up by offering we're going to go ahead and bring back the family night, the Christian faith or church family night. And that's going to make up for this stuff? Are you kidding?
Well, and that's where, what do you do about it? Well, again, I've been a Dodger fan my entire life. No more. I will never buy a single piece of merchandise. I will not watch their games. I won't do any of it. And it's not, and look, I hate that for people within the Dodgers organization that had nothing to do with this. But the problem is that more and more of these institutions believe that they can make these decisions with impunity. And what's amazing is that they can then think they can come back to you as a consumer and say, oh, so you want this person to lose their job, or, oh, you want, no, I want you to focus on what it is you were always supposed to do, which is create a good ball club. That's what I want you to do. I don't want you to wait in all of this. Again, we didn't ask for the cultural wars within baseball. They wanted them. Well, now you got them. And if there's no consequences to it, if they can just do stuff like this, well, then they'll continue to do. They'll perpetuate. And if you think this is where it ends, let me tell you something. It doesn't end with any of this. Anything you can imagine right now is not the ending point.
No.
It just isn't. It is not the ending point. They'll always come up with something else.
It's always what we're living through will always be the starting point of what will come next.
Well,
there will never be an ending point.
I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but it really feels to me like somebody hit the accelerator on this stuff.
Yeah.
And it is surging off the cliff. I mean,
Gradually
and
at
this
first
isn't even it. Like we start at one point, you'll say, oh, if we start this, they're going to do this next. And people go, oh, no way. And now what are we doing? We're seeing them trying to take the stigma away from pedophilia and rename it MAPS, minor attracted persons. So you're telling me you're worried about this stigma, and now pedophiles are a marginalized group?
Yeah.
And so the idea that we would be here, like 10 years ago, we never would have believed we'd be right here. But we are. Here we are.
You know what's interesting is that you're going to have people, and I know there's people on the right, they're going to be like, oh, that'll never happen, right? Oh, they're never going to be able to go that far to normalize things like pedophilia or anything like that.
And they will.
Oh no, I get it. You know who it will be? It will be colleagues on my side of the aisle that will tell me, "Oh, well, Nick, that's no, they wouldn't do that." Yes, they would. Like, what is it going to take for you to understand that you're not dealing with somebody that shares a similar worldview as you do? Their worldview is diametrically opposed to you. You are an old white, cisgendered, heteronormative oppressor. Do you get it? You're not Bob, right? This is who you are. And yes, they will sit there and smile to your face and have a drink with you and everything else, and then they will vote lockstep on every single one of these things. Like, I don't know what it's going to take for you to snap out of it, because again, for some of them, and that's part of the problem. Some people, they have long lasting relationships. Like, they would never do that. I'm like, I don't know how to explain this any better than to say that.
Here's how you explain it.
I know. I don't. It's not that they would have done it 10 years ago. It's not that they might have done it 20 years ago. It might not even be that the individual we're talking about is conscious that that's the direction it's going. But they've picked a side, and brother, you ain't on it. And there's going to come a point where they're going to have to pick between their side and you, and the little friendship you've developed 60 days out of the year in Richmond, having a beer together and shooting this, is not going to overcome what their side wants to do with you. And I don't know how much more evident they have to make it at this point that you're the bad guy, you're evil. And they do believe that about you.
They'll just shoot you last.
For those that are on the right, that don't think that any of this will ever happen, or, oh, you're being hysterical, you're fear mongering, you're just peddling whatever. Ask yourself, how many Democrats would have voted for, Leah Thomas competing against Riley Gaines? Voted to legalize that. How many Democrats 20 years ago would have voted for that? How many Democrats would have voted to allow biological men into women's restrooms in public schools in Northern Virginia?
Well, now
20
you've
years
got
ago.
Democrats in subcommittee hearings when Riley Gaines was there, and look at how they treated her.
Yeah.
They were like, "Oh, you're basically you're uncomfortable with naked male genitalia in your locker room with you, you bigot.
You're just picking on kids who are different than you."
Yeah.
I mean, picking on kids who are different was actually said.
And it used to be something where, like, a girl could say, I'm very uncomfortable with this. Like, especially when they want to sit here and say that, rape culture is a thing all throughout society. And then in the midst of all this rape culture stuff, you're going to tell a girl she's a bigot because she's uncomfortable seeing male genitalia exposed to her.
Well,
ask yourself, think of all of these things, like the sports stuff, the stuff in school bathrooms. Like, how many Democrats 20 years ago would have voted for Drag Queen Story Hour?
Yeah.
Almost none.
No.
Almost none of them.
Oh, no. 20 years ago, they were still saying that marriage was between one man and one woman.
Obama said that.
Yeah.
So Basti asked the question, can you talk about subjective morality? People need to understand this. Yeah, subjective morality is essentially the opposite of objective morality. It's the idea that morality is purely... Let's start with objective morality. So obviously, like in a Christian worldview, we believe that morality stems from God's will, like God's created order, and that there's some things that are objectively right and objectively wrong. So, for instance, murder is always wrong. Killing is not always wrong. If you have to kill in self-defense, that's different than murder. These are the sort of distinctions that we make. But a lot of that law is rooted in, a lot of that morality is rooted in the idea of harm done to other people. So the question has been for a lot of people, like, okay, how do we differentiate between those things with which we generally agree are immoral or objectively immoral, and those things which may be subjective? The real thing to understand here is, I believe in objective morality. So, like, for instance, cheating on your spouse is wrong all the time. There's no situation where cheating on your spouse is acceptable. Do I think that the government should then come in and legally punish you for doing that? Well, that I think can be problematic, right? There are other things where I believe as a Christian that certain behaviors are immoral. Does that mean I believe the government should punish you for those behaviors? Like, for instance, I believe drunkenness is immoral. In my faith, you're not allowed to get drunk. Does that mean the government should punish you if you get drunk in the privacy of your own home? No, I don't think so. Because I don't want the government to have that kind of power. So the idea is that it's not that my morality is subjective, it's that it's always objective, but I also understand that there's certain places where certain moral laws or traditions are enforced. Some of them, first and foremost, it has to be enforced with yourself. You have to actually use personal responsibility and personal conviction. Secondly, it's the family structure. You're supposed to raise your kids in the way that they should go. Then you have cultural and social institutions. People always say, like, oh, you conservatives, you say you don't like cancel culture, but you want to cancel Bud Light. There's a big difference from going back and looking at someone's Twitter page from 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago and saying, this person is now unacceptable because of a joke that they made 10 years ago that might have been, bad or not the best, but wasn't necessarily culturally unacceptable. There's a big difference between that and saying, if you choose to engage in things that I find directly offensive or against my moral values, I'm not going to do business with you. There's a difference between those two things.
Voting with your dollar.
Yeah, there's a difference between those two things. But if you're someone that believes that all morality is subjective, or you have a worldview which does not provide for objective morality, which is to say morality regardless of what someone else might believe about it, well then everything's on the table. This essentially becomes utilitarianism or might makes right. If I have the ability to impose my morals, well then those are the ones that we're going to abide by because I can hurt you if you don't follow them. Objective morality says that even if I can't impose these moral values, or even if I don't think a government should impose these moral values, it doesn't make them any less moral. There's still a God, there's still justice, and there's still consequences for those things. So, but again, if all morality is subjective, then literally everything is on the table. Everything. The worst thing that you can possibly imagine now can be justified within a framework that believes morality is subjective. All you need is the proper conditions for which it can be carried out, for which someone believes they can get away with it, and they will engage in it. Or, better yet, for people to believe that, if they honestly believe that that morality is nothing more than subjective and essentially your ability to either carry it out or get away with it or create cultural conditions where it's appropriate, if that's all that determines morality, well then anything you can get, not even a majority sometimes just a loud minority of the population to agree with, you can justify within the public square. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the majority at this point come down and going like, I just don't want to have these conversations. The ick factor is too high, so I don't want to have these conversations. Well, I got news for you. It's happening whether you have the conversation or not. The question is where will you have stood on this? And what sort of positive action will you have taken to make sure that, hey, look, no, I not only stood here, but I also made sure that people understood that there was a line that you weren't going to cross. So at the very end of the article, they came up with a strategy for defeating cultural Marxism. And this is what Heritage puts out. The first thing they say is focus locally. Cultural Marxists have already shown the way. Their long march through the institutions should inform the counter strategy. While conservatives focused on the high-level aspects of American politics, national races, general elections, presidential campaigns, and policies that were driven from the top down, the Gramscians took monies from left-leaning donors and mega foundations and focused their side on local centers of political and cultural dominance. I think that's true.
That's the message that we have pushed repeatedly on this podcast, is that nobody, the line that Nick uses is nobody's coming to save you. Certainly nobody in government is coming to save you. And certainly nobody in DC is coming to save you. I hope and pray that if you listen or watch to this podcast, that you no longer believe that anybody in Washington, DC is coming to save you.
Yeah,
that is not happening.
So this is one of the things they talk about that I agree with. It's and they give some examples, from using Soros money to fund social justice candidates for district attorney's office to installing pro-CRT officials on school boards. The approach is skewed, the obvious, and national for the more impactful, subtle, and local centers of power. Conservatives must take these territories first. So a bit, that kind of that liberal bumper sticker where it's think globally, act locally. It's true. It's true. You have a lot of conservatives that they want to focus on a presidential election, or they want to focus even on like a gubernatorial election or whatever it is, because that's easy. I mean, let's be honest, that's easy. And to be somewhat kind here, it's because we usually have a lot of other things to do with respect to, running our lives, our businesses, our, stuff with our families. And so politics is something that we engage in primarily as an afterthought. It's not the primary source of our meaning and purpose in life. And when it's not the primary source of meaning and purpose in your life, then you're not going to give it the same level of attention. So the question that I always ask people is like, okay, I'm not expecting you to care about politics more than your faith, more than your family. I'm not expecting you to do that. I don't think you should do that. But I do think you should care about it enough to make sure that it's not coming in and harming your either your family or your faith or what. I think you should care enough to do that. And you should also look at what are the different ways that you actually, quote, act locally. It's not just your school board. Like one of the frustrating parts I have here for some of these things is that it's still focused on, and that's why you should contribute to local civic organizations or your local school board. Yes, those things are important. You should do those things. You should also start looking for alternatives to those things, right?
It's the whole looking for an exit.
You can. Well, it's not even exit from. One of the things that Marxists have proven time and time again throughout history is they can't do it without us. They can't do it without us.
Yeah, that's why I said look for an exit.
Politicians are really, really good at it. I don't know if I published this already, but we got a reel going out where I said, I just want everyone to understand how this ends, right? The politicians promising you the free stuff, they don't own the free stuff. They don't actually know how to make the free stuff. All they know how to do is steal the stuff from people that do know how to make it and then hand it out for votes. And then eventually over time, the people that make the stuff, the people that earn the stuff, they get tired of being punished for making and earning, and they leave or they just stop. And then you're left with politicians stealing stuff that is no longer there. Right? That's it. That's all you get left over. They can't do this without us. If they could effectively run societies, then the societies they've actually tried to run wouldn't be crap. People wouldn't be desperately fleeing those societies to get to the ones that they haven't been running.
And they're doing that here in the U.S. Look at how many people are leaving California, New York, and Illinois and moving to Tennessee, Texas, and Florida.
Yeah. I mean, Detroit is a long-standing example.
We're not just talking about, look at all these people that have fled communist regimes like Cuba or China and stuff. No, like in the U.S., look at places where the left has had uninterrupted control, in some cases for almost a century.
Yeah.
And look at how many people are fleeing those societies, or in some cases they've had control for decades. California is an example. They've controlled the state easily since the 80s. And people are moving out en masse. Look at cities where the most right-wing person on the city council is a typical progressive
Yeah.
in rural Virginia. Those are places like Seattle, places like San Francisco, Portland. And look at how many people are moving out of those places. Like in 1 year alone, Manhattan lost 8% of its population in 1 year.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think that the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that, like, the data is the sad thing is that the data is on our side, but there's actually too much data. And part of the problem is that people have just other stuff going on in their lives, right? They've got other commitments. We're gracious enough that somebody who's listening to our show is already given 2 hours of their time to listen to us. The problem that I think a lot of conservatives have, and maybe this will be teeing up for you to close if you want, Nick. The problem that I think a lot of conservatives have is that not that they don't think the data is on their side, but there's too much data. Remember when I was mentioning earlier that, like, all the data, like the marriage rates, the men in the workforce, all these things are pointing to the fact that cultural Marxism is destroying society. And I think that people that philosophically agree with us, at least somewhat, know that there is something like catastrophically wrong with what is going on right now, and that basically they're quite frankly, they're just flat out embarrassed at what's happening to their country, their communities, their society. And in some ways it's demoralizing because they don't know what to do about it, right?
Well,
they're just one person. They're just one vote.
Yeah, but what does happen is, and especially using social media and other things like that, is that we stay in an echo chamber. We gather around ourselves people who believe similarly to what we believe, and we discuss all of this at length and solve the world's problems together at the table with our friends. But how many of these people don't actually go out? And I mean, I can honestly say we're going out and actually
Speak for yourself. I don't even leave my house.
Okay, well,
we're going out.
We're putting content out there
I get what
to
you
be
mean.
consumed. However, there's a lot of folks that they aren't doing that. At work, they are being silenced and shamed into silence by the woke folks that they work with. I mean,
Hamilton and I have a friend.
There's-
Hamilton, you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Our
Real
friend
quick,
in
real quick, I
Richmond.
want to thank Ben Dillon for the donation. Thank you very much, Ben. It's great.
well, I'm glad you've got a friend, but I was going to say,
No. What I was saying is he works at a.
What she's saying is that if you interrupt her again, she's going to hit you with her coffee mug.
I'm sorry, Tina. I don't mean to interrupt you. You can go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that I know two young people who work at a really benign place. I can't name names because I can't name names. And they feel there are certain customers that come in and things like that, and they feel no shame whatsoever to sit there and spout off very controversial things. I mean, they'll talk about abortion, they'll talk about trans issues, they'll talk about, all kinds of sexual things. And these two people feel like they can't speak up because those people, the other side, is allowed to go in and just say everything they want to say. But the minute they speak up, you're going to get a bad Yelp review. You're going to get canceled. Somebody's going to write you up or whatever it might be. And so we do actually exist now in this weird place where if you do speak up in the workplace, you are totally punished for it, whereas anybody else can talk about those other issues and everyone's terrified to do anything about it because they'll probably get sued or something like that.
That is a really good reason why we need more conservative entrepreneurs.
We
starting
do.
businesses.
We do, but can I also say this? We also the reason why
squeaky wheel gets the oil, so be squeaky.
That's true, but don't be obnoxious.
Well, I'm not saying to be obnoxious. It's just that we do need to start talking about it and get out there and not be silenced. Like, the more we allow ourselves to be silenced, the worse this is going to get. It's not getting better.
No, I agree. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you've seen Bud Light and even Target now is having some issues. They're like, oh crap, we might have gone a little bit too far on this. And it's because there are enough people, because conservatives are actually getting better at not using certain goods and services if they're going to blatantly take sides in this whole thing. And conservatives, generally speaking, have not been very good at that. So when we get on this whole focus locally thing, that's part of what it is what sort of behaviors are you engaging in that really assist with that. How effective are you being? And I think you're absolutely right. Part of this does have to do with oh wow, Ron, thank you very much. really appreciate the donation, Ron. That was huge. I'm sorry, Mihai Sandor. I saw Ron next to the dollar
The
amount.
currency is RON.
Yeah, I saw that. No, thank you very much.
I have a quote that I'd love to read off because I want your take on this, Nick, because I think this encapsulates what Tina was trying to say.
Go ahead.
Here's what this guy has to say. He says, we have witnessed the development of that strange system of liberty in which you are told you are free, but think with us, or we will denounce you to the vengeance of the people. You are free, but bow down your head to the idol we worship, or we will denounce you to the vengeance of the people. You are free, but join us in persecuting the men whose probity and intelligence we dread, or we will denounce you to the vengeance of the people. Citizens, we have reason to fear that the revolution, like Saturn, will devour successively all of its children and only engender despotism and the calamities which accompany it. This is a quote by a member of the French National Assembly, Pierre Verginaud, dated March 11th, 1793. Verginaud, at the end of the year, ended up being beheaded.
Yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds like some standard issue French Revolution stuff right there. Well, and that's, again, if you're not willing to stand up right now, there's going to potentially be cost for speaking out. But if you're not willing to speak out when the costs are at this, and this is what's interesting, when the cost is I wouldn't say insignificant, but not catastrophic, right? You're not being shipped off to the gulag. It's actually easier for people to remain silent, I think, in some situations, because it's not so blatant.
You're not being guillotined
but the problem, the problem is when you don't speak up in a situation like this, you are inviting further encroachments. And like Tina said, we're creating, like, social conditions are being established now to where if I talk about my Christian faith, or if I talk about something benign, where we say something like, yeah, you know what, we think, we didn't let our kids date until they were 18 because we thought it was appropriate for them to develop, socially, mentally, intellectually, spiritually, physically before they started to get. That would be an awkward conversation right now in some settings. But if somebody else wants to talk about the kink thing they experienced at a pride rally, well, I'm just supposed to sit there and understand that that's beautiful and brave and bold and stunning, right? And if I don't, there's something wrong with me. So the only way to combat situations like that is you have to be willing to, again, effectively share your point of view on things. And when somebody comes back and gets more hostile, let them. This is one of the things that I always express to people. The madder the other person gets, the more calm, cool, and collected you become. See, they want you to get mad. They want you to be so offended in what you're talking about that you blow up, or you say something stupid, or you do say something offensive. You don't speak the truth in love. You just speak the truth in absolute anger and animosity. So what you need to remember when you go into these situations, that's what they want you to do. Don't do it. Don't do it. Another effective way to do this, because, again, our oldest daughter finds herself in a lot of situations where she's interacting with people that do not agree with her, oppose her worldview, but they've grown to like her, in part because of when she does engage, she'll ask a lot of questions. What about this? What do you think about this? How about this? Why is this? Or why is this and this? She'll show the inherent contradictions that demonstrate that, no, the worldview that you're pushing is not tolerant and it's not compassionate. It's different. If you want to argue that you're correct, okay, but you're not the things that you're advertising yourself as. And sometimes the only way that you can get to the bottom of that is by asking questions and opening up the other person within their own presuppositions, which they seem to assume that everybody just shares now. Mm-hmm. But if we're not willing to be actually bold and have those conversations, if it is more important for us to be comfortable than to actually step up and combat some of the things that are happening, well, then you're going to lose, and you deserve to. Mm-hmm. You deserve to, because clearly you weren't worthy enough to protect the very thing that you say you believe in and that you love and that you cherish. And since you weren't, well, then the quicker it all happens and we actually produce a generation of people that are willing to stand up and fight for it, the better, because that's the only way we're actually going to correct.
This is why
There-
education is the number one political
And
issue.
as you say, education is the number one political issue. There is something I sent in our. Did you happen to see it?
I did. Yep. Pulling it up
Can
right
you
now.
play it? Because I just feel like this is just perfect. It's Catherine Burbles. I cannot say her name, but she gives a speech at the National Conservatism Conference. And she's a teacher. If you could pull that up, is it possible?
Having a bit of trouble. Give me one
Oh,
moment.
dang.
this
Because
is on
this
Instagram.
conversation, I feel like, man, this would be really, really good to share real quick, because every single word she says really harkens to this. And the idea that we have all of these kids coming up, these are our future leaders.
Yeah.
And look at what we're doing to them. We're absolutely shredding their ability to think, logically. And is there any possibility?
Can you DM it to me, Tina?
Sure. Let me do that real quick.
No, I think that's true. Is we're looking at some of this stuff, and it's become so easy to be like, oh, that's just academia, or that's just Hollywood, and that's just how they operate, or the kids these days are tomorrow's leaders, people.
That's the whole point of what Gramsci was talking about, right? The whole false consciousness is now collective. Like now that's us saying, oh, well, that's just Hollywood, or oh, that's just academia. We have become normalized into accepting this as just the default. Oh, that's just the way that it is. That's the way that it should be.
But can I say the other reason why? And by the way, there's some stuff that Heritage Foundation asked for that I think is just they like one of the solutions by Heritage Foundation is reclassify social media providers as public utilities. Can I just say right now, do not do that. You don't give the government control of social media. Heritage Foundation. I like a lot of things you say. That ain't one of them. But I think the most important effective thing is that the more you are actually able, and again, the more capabilities you have, like we've been talking about, hey, for the next 90 days, we're all committing to do various things, whether it's read certain things, learn different skills, learn different assets, work out, become more formidable intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and all these other things. Why do you do all of those things? You do them in part so that when you do stand up and say something and they try to cancel you or they try to threaten you or they try to intimidate you, they can't. Because economically, you know how to take care of yourself. Physically, you know how to take care of yourself. Spiritually, you know what you believe and why. Emotionally, you have a network of people around you that care about you and you care about them. So what are they canceling? What are they canceling at that point? That's part of the reason why you make yourself, that's part of the reason why you improve and focus on these things, so that you can be that person that's willing to stand up in the hopes that other people will also be inspired and encouraged by it and do the same. But even if they don't, at least you knew you stood up for what was right, and you've created the things that you need in place to be able to provide for your family, to be able to provide for your community, even if you are canceled, even if they do come after you. That's one of the ways that you actually encourage people. It's, they talk about, we used to talk about this in the military when it talks about like bravery and things like that. Yeah, some of that is spiritual and it's emotional, everything else. But another part of that is actually it's the training. It's the deliberate discipline that you develop over time, so that when the bad thing happens, or when the crisis happens, or when the danger happens, you're ready for it. You didn't just rely on your, insistence that, oh yeah, I'm a good person, I'll do the right thing in the good situation. Nope. You developed the sort of discipline that you needed to be able to create yourself into that sort of person. All right, now we got the video up.
Yep.
All right.
This is in the UK, apparently. Which
The
is kind of
fact that our nation's culture is not only created in our schools, but that it is our children who are leading the development of that culture in our schools. Adult authority is long gone. So here I am, ringing the alarm. In 20 years, many of us will be retired or sadly dead. And the children in our schools will be in important and influential positions in our institutions. As G.K. Chesterton said, the true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. Well, I'm asking, how much do you love your country? How much do you love the values that you claim to defend? Do you love them enough to tweet under your own name? Do you love them enough to change your child's school to one that's less woke and ignore the impact on your social status? Do you love them enough to do more than simply chat to your friends who already agree with you at dinner parties? For heaven's sake, man, stand up and be counted. As Russell Crowe says in the film Gladiator, a clip I regularly play for my staff, hold the line, stay with me. What we do in life echoes in eternity. Will your life echo hollow with cowardly hypocrisy, or will it echo with courage, valiance, and honor? The choice is yours. Strength and honor be with you all. Now get yourselves to detention. You have a minute.
That was great.
Yeah.
was
I saw
great.
that this morning. I didn't even realize it was going to fit in this podcast, so I had to do that on the fly. Sorry, guys.
No, Miss Led, thank you for the donation. Really appreciate it. In case you want a new coffee cup. I did need to do some more rotating on the coffee mugs. No, that was a great battle. Look, we've been at this for a little over 2 hours now, so I'm gonna wrap this up. Appreciate you guys all sticking with us. Again, the purpose of this was to try to provide kind of like a an underlying explanation of what have been some of the philosophies, the institutions, and the people that have behind what we're seeing today, and recognizing that what we're seeing today, it was the seeds for this were planted a long, long time ago. This is not new. This is not overnight, and it doesn't get solved by individual political campaigns or election cycles. It really gets solved when people that actually do have, a passion for what it is that we believe in. Stand up and are willing to actually fight for them across those institutions and within our communities. One of the things that you will find very, very encouraging as you do this, and one of the reasons why we talked about, like on the whole 90-day challenge, we said seek out communities of like-minded people, not because you're trying to isolate yourself from other people that don't agree with you. You don't want to do that. You don't want to isolate yourself in that respect. But because you do want people that share in similar goals. Because you're going to find that when we talk about intentional communities, when we talk about being able to be there for people when you need it most, you're going to find those people among those that actually share common values with you. And so it's important to reach out and find those groups that you can work with. And they're going to be religious in nature. They're going to be civically minded in nature. They're going to be interest driven as well. I am super looking forward to going to the Homesteaders Conference that's coming up this October here in Virginia. That's going to be a blast. And I'm going to run into people that I don't agree with on every aspect of my political philosophy, every aspect of my religion, but there are shared values there that are so critical that allow us to be able to work and to cooperate with one another. And to be able to build things. And that's so important for all of this. Because as we have said multiple times, and then I will drive home every opportunity I get, it is not good enough to point out to the lie. You have to point to the truth as well. Because people will hold on to convenient lies, especially when they don't see anywhere else to go. And hopefully we are providing some intellectual groundwork for understanding the nature of the problem that we're in, because we've got to properly identify the problem, properly diagnose what the effective treatment is, and then be proactive and actually engaging in the sort of arguments, debates, behaviors, actions, and transactions that will allow us to defend a world that believes in individual liberty, objective morality, and truly believes that you have a right to live your life in accordance with your definition of happiness, provided you're not infringing on the rights of others to be able to do the same. And I'm very happy for our audience that comes in, that gives us, not only their support through watching, through liking, through sharing, but also their financial support, and also engages in this conversation in order to help make the show better. Please let us know on here. And if you haven't joined Circle, please join our Circle group there and give us some more advice on episodes that you would like to see in the future.
Link in the description.
Link is in the description. And with that, we will let you go back to the rest of your day. And thank you very much for joining us.